This video digs into every scrap of information we could find about Stella Montis, the research facility buried in the northern Italian mountains. And I've organized it chronologically rather than by faction to show how this place evolved from a hopeful scientific outpost into something far darker. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. Chapter 1. The Mountain's Shadow. Stella Montis wasn't always a secret. In the years before the Ark arrived, it existed as a modest geological survey station tucked into the Rust Belt's northern ranges. The Italian government had established it in the early 2000s to monitor seismic activity in the region. Small team, limited budget, nothing remarkable, but the location itself was perfect for what would come later. The mountains provided natural insulation from prying eyes. The bedrock was stable enough to support underground expansion, and most importantly, it was remote enough that nobody would ask questions when things started to change. The transformation began in 2019. That's when the first Ark fragments started appearing in the upper atmosphere. Most governments were still denying the phenomenon publicly, but privately, they were scrambling. Italy's scientific community had been tracking unusual magnetic anomalies for months. Someone in the Ministry of Defense made a decision. Stella Montis would be repurposed. The geological survey team was quietly reassigned. New personnel arrived within weeks. These weren't seismologists or geologists. They were physicists, materials scientists, xenobiologists, experts in fields that officially didn't exist yet. The facility's expansion happened under the cover of a routine infrastructure upgrade. Local contractors were hired to dig deeper into the mountain. They were told they were building storage facilities for geological samples. Most of them never questioned it. The pay was good, and the Rust Belt economy needed every job it could get. But a few workers noticed strange things. Equipment that looked more like it belonged in a hospital than a geology lab. Reinforced containment chambers, radiation shielding. One contractor mentioned seeing what looked like a clean room being installed 300 meters underground. He was paid a substantial bonus and asked to sign an expanded non-disclosure agreement. By 2020, Stella Montis had effectively vanished from public records. The geological survey station still existed on paper, but the budget line had been absorbed into a classified defense appropriation. The original entrance was maintained as a facade. A skeleton crew of researchers kept up appearances, publishing occasional papers on regional seismic patterns. But the real work was happening in the expanded sections below. 3 levels had been carved into the mountain by this point. Each one was dedicated to different aspects of Ark research. The technology was primitive by later standards, but it was a start. The first Ark samples arrived in March 2020. Small fragments, no larger than a fist, recovered from a meteorite impact site in the Dolomites. The official story was that these were normal meteorites being studied for mineral content. The truth was far more interesting. These fragments exhibited properties that violated known physics. They generated electromagnetic fields without an apparent power source. They remained at a constant temperature regardless of external conditions, and when examined under electron microscopy, their internal structure seemed to shift and reconfigure itself. The research team at Stella Montis had no framework for understanding what they were looking at. They were operating in complete darkness, inventing new scientific disciplines as they went. Dr. Elena Voss was the facility's first director. Her background was in theoretical physics, specifically quantum mechanics and field theory. She'd been recruited from CERN, where she'd been working on particle collision experiments. The Italian government had offered her unlimited funding and complete autonomy. The only condition was absolute secrecy. Voss accepted immediately. She saw the Ark fragments as the opportunity of a lifetime, a chance to rewrite humanity's understanding of the universe. She assembled a team of 40 researchers in those early months. Each one was chosen for their willingness to work outside conventional scientific paradigms. And each one was willing to disappear from their previous lives. The initial research focused on basic material analysis. The team needed to understand what Ark fragments were made of before they could begin to understand how they functioned. But standard analytical techniques proved useless. Spectroscopy revealed elemental compositions that seemed to change between measurements. X-ray diffraction patterns were inconsistent. Chemical tests produced contradictory results. It was as if the fragments existed in multiple states simultaneously. One researcher suggested they were dealing with matter that operated under different physical laws. Another proposed that the fragments were somehow entangled with parallel dimensions. These ideas would have been dismissed as pseudoscience in any conventional laboratory. At Stella Montis, they became working hypotheses. The breakthrough came in July 2020. A young materials scientist named Marco Delacroix was conducting stress tests on a fragment sample. He applied increasing pressure using a diamond anvil cell, measuring how the fragment responded. At a specific pressure threshold, the fragment's electromagnetic signature suddenly spiked. The field it generated became coherent, structured, almost like it was transmitting information. Delacroix had inadvertently discovered that arc materials responded to external stimuli. They weren't passive objects, they were reactive systems. This single observation changed everything. If arc fragments could be stimulated to produce specific responses, they could potentially be controlled. And if they could be controlled, they could be weaponized. The Italian government's interest in Stella Montis intensified immediately. Defense officials who had previously viewed the facility as a speculative research project suddenly saw strategic value. Additional funding flooded in. The facility expanded to 5 levels. New equipment was installed, much of it custom-built to specifications that didn't exist in any standard catalogue. The team grew to over 100 personnel, but the expansion came with new oversight. Military liaisons were assigned to the facility. They didn't interfere with day-to-day operations, but their presence was a constant reminder of the facility's true purpose. Stella Montis wasn't just studying the Ark, it was preparing for war with it. Dr. Voss struggled with this shift in mission. She'd come to Stella Montis to advance human knowledge, not to build weapons. But she also understood the reality of the situation. The Ark was descending. Every analysis suggested it would reach Earth's surface within a decade. Humanity needed to be ready. If that meant turning her research into defensive technologies, she would accept it. But she insisted on maintaining scientific rigor. Every experiment would be documented. Every result would be peer-reviewed internally. Stella Montis might be a military project, but it would operate with scientific integrity. That compromise allowed her to continue leading the facility, but it also planted the seeds of the conflicts that would eventually tear the project apart. The team made steady progress through 2021. They learned that arc fragments generated their electromagnetic fields through a process that resembled quantum entanglement, but operated at a macro scale. They discovered that the fragment's temperature stability was achieved through some form of active energy regulation. They even managed to induce controlled reactions in samples by applying specific frequency pulses. Each discovery raised more questions than it answered. The arc technology was so far beyond human science that the researchers often felt like they were groping in the dark. But they persisted. They had to, because with each passing month, the arc grew closer. The facility's expansion continued into the mountain. By late 2200, Stella Montis had 7 levels extending nearly a kilometer into the bedrock. The deepest levels housed the most sensitive experiments. These were the areas where researchers worked with larger arc samples, testing more aggressive stimulation protocols. Safety concerns were paramount. The fragments had proven capable of releasing tremendous energy when improperly handled. 3 researchers had been injured in separate incidents, suffering from exposure to radiation types that didn't exist in any textbook. Voss implemented strict safety protocols. No experiment involving samples larger than 5 kilos would proceed without multiple redundant containment systems. Personnel working in high-risk areas would be rotated regularly to minimize exposure. These measures helped, but they couldn't eliminate the danger entirely. The human cost of the research was becoming apparent. Several team members developed unusual symptoms: headaches, temporal disorientation, vivid dreams that felt more real than waking life. The facility's medical staff couldn't find any physical cause. All blood work came back normal. Brain scans showed no abnormalities. Yet the symptoms persisted and seemed to worsen with prolonged exposure to active arc samples. One researcher, Dr. Sarah Chen, claimed she could feel the fragments calling to her. She described it as a pressure in her mind, like someone trying to communicate in a language she almost understood. The medical team diagnosed her with work-related stress and recommended leave. She refused. 2 weeks later, she walked into one of the containment chambers during an active experiment and had to be physically restrained by security. She was removed from the facility immediately and placed under psychiatric observation. Officially, it was a breakdown caused by overwork, but the other researchers whispered different theories. The incident with Chen forced Voss to confront an uncomfortable possibility. What if the arc fragments weren't just responding to human stimulation? What if they were actively influencing the researchers? The idea seemed absurd, like paranoid science fiction, but the evidence was hard to ignore. Multiple team members reported similar experiences, dreams of structures they'd never seen, feelings of recognition when examining new samples, instinctive understanding of arc systems that should have required years of study to grasp. Some researchers were developing almost intuitive abilities to predict how fragments would respond to different stimuli. It was as if prolonged exposure was creating some form of connection. Voss ordered a comprehensive study of all personnel, neurological screenings, psychological evaluations, the works. The results were disturbing. Subtle changes in brain chemistry, altered patterns of neural activity, nothing that would be flagged in a routine medical exam, but significant when you knew what to look for. The question became whether these changes were harmful. Were the researchers being damaged by their exposure to arc materials, or were they adapting to it? Voss didn't have an answer. The medical data was too limited. They were in completely uncharted territory. She made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her career. The research would continue. Personnel would be monitored closely, but unless someone showed signs of actual impairment, they would remain on their projects. The justification was simple. Humanity needed to understand the arc, and the affected researchers were developing insights that normal scientists couldn't access. It was a calculated risk, but it was also a moral compromise. Voss was allowing her team to be changed by their research, potentially irreversibly, because the mission was too important to stop. Not everyone agreed with this decision. Several senior researchers objected. They argued that continuing to expose personnel to arc materials without understanding the long-term effects was unethical. One physicist, Dr. Anton Reeves, threatened to go public with his concerns. Voss met with him privately. She explained the stakes. The arc was coming regardless of what happened at Stella Montis. Every month of research brought humanity closer to having defensive capabilities. Every breakthrough increased the chances of survival. Could they really afford to slow down over theoretical risks? Reeves wasn't convinced, but he agreed to keep his concerns internal. For now, but the conversation revealed a growing divide within the facility. Some researchers saw themselves as scientists, others saw themselves as soldiers in an undeclared war. The divide deepened in early 2002 when the military liaisons began pushing for more aggressive research timelines. They wanted weapons prototypes, not theoretical papers. They wanted systems that could be deployed, not laboratory curiosities. Voss pushed back. Science couldn't be rushed. Understanding arc technology required methodical experimentation and careful analysis. The liaisons didn't care. They had intelligence suggesting other nations were making similar progress. China had a facility in the Himalayas. The United States had multiple sites across the Midwest. Russia was conducting research in Siberia. Everyone was racing toward the same goal. The first nation to weaponize arc technology would have an overwhelming strategic advantage. Italy couldn't afford to fall behind. The pressure led to mistakes. In April 2000 and 2002, a team attempted to activate a fragment cluster that was larger than previous safety protocols allowed. The goal was to test whether multiple fragments could be synchronized to produce a more powerful and coherent field effect. The experiment was conducted in one of the deep containment chambers with every available safety system active. For the first 3 minutes, everything proceeded normally. The fragments responded to the stimulation pulses exactly as predicted. Their individual fields began to align and reinforce each other. Then something unexpected happened. The fragments didn't just synchronize, they amplified. The combined field effect was orders of magnitude more powerful than theoretical models had predicted. The containment systems strained to contain the energy release. Alarms shrieked through the facility. Automated safety protocols triggered, flooding the chamber with electromagnetic dampening fields. The crisis lasted 8 minutes. 8 minutes of pure chaos as the research team fought to regain control of the experiment. They succeeded, but barely. The fragments were shut down and separated. The containment chamber was sealed. No one was injured. But when the team reviewed the data, they realized how close they'd come to disaster. If the containment had failed, the energy release would have vaporized everything within a 100-meter radius, possibly more. They'd been playing with forces they didn't fully understand, and it had nearly killed them all. Voss ordered a complete halt to all experiments involving multiple fragments. The team would return to single-sample studies until they had better theoretical models. The military liaisons were furious. They saw the incident as proof that Stella Montis was being too cautious. Voss saw it as proof they hadn't been cautious enough. The argument over research direction came to a head in June 2022. A delegation of defense officials arrived at Stella Montis for an inspection. They toured the facility, reviewed the research data, and met with key personnel. Then they delivered their assessment. Progress was insufficient. The timeline was unacceptable. Changes would be made. Voss was relieved of her position as director. She would remain at the facility as a senior researcher, but operational control would transfer to Dr. Marcus Wolf, a physicist with a background in weapons development. Wolf had been working at Stella Montis for 6 months. He was brilliant, ruthless, and completely aligned with the military's priorities. He saw arc technology as a tool, nothing more. Understanding it was less important than using it. The transition was brutal. Wolf immediately restructured the research program. Theoretical studies were deprioritized. Applied weapons research became the focus. Safety protocols were relaxed. Experiment timelines were compressed. Personnel who objected were reassigned or dismissed. Within 2 months, Stella Montis had transformed from a scientific research facility into a weapons development program. Some researchers adapted, others resigned in protest. A few, like Voss, stayed on in diminished roles, hoping to moderate the worst excesses. But they had little real influence. Wolf ran the facility with military efficiency. Results were all that mattered. The human cost was irrelevant. The first weapon prototype was completed in September 2022. It was a directed energy weapon that used a stabilized arc fragment as its core. When activated, it projected a coherent electromagnetic beam capable of disrupting electronic systems at ranges up to 2 kilometers. The military liaisons were ecstatic. They demanded immediate field testing. Wolf obliged. A remote testing range was established in the mountains 30 kilometers from Stella Montis. The weapon was fired under controlled conditions. It worked perfectly. Every electronic device within the beam's path was instantly disabled. Computers, radios, vehicles, everything. The pulse even affected hardened military equipment that was supposed to be resistant to electromagnetic interference. It was devastatingly effective. And it was just the beginning. Chapter 2. Descent into Darkness. Wolf's success with the first prototype opened the floodgates. Funding doubled. The facility expanded to 9 levels. New research teams were brought in, many of them with backgrounds in defense contracting rather than pure science. The culture at Stella Montis changed completely. Where Voss had encouraged open collaboration and peer review, Wolf compartmentalized everything. Researchers only knew about their specific projects. Cross-team communication was discouraged. Security was tightened to paranoid levels. Even personnel who'd been at the facility since the beginning found themselves locked out of areas they'd previously accessed freely. Stella Montis was no longer a research facility. It was a black site. The weapons development program expanded rapidly. The electromagnetic pulse weapon was refined and miniaturized. Prototype 2 was small enough to be man-portable. Prototype 3 could be mounted on a vehicle. By early 2023, the Italian military had deployed 20 units to classified locations. But Wolf wasn't satisfied. The EMP weapon was useful, but it was defensive. He wanted offensive capabilities. He wanted something that could kill. The arc fragments had proven capable of releasing tremendous kinetic energy when properly stimulated. Wolf believed they could be weaponized directly, not as a power source for conventional weapons, but as the weapon itself, a kinetic projector that could accelerate matter to hypersonic velocities. or an energy lance that could cut through armor like tissue. The theoretical framework existed. It just needed to be realized. The research required larger arc samples, much larger. Everything developed so far had used fragments no bigger than a human fist. What Wolf proposed would need samples measured in tons, not kilograms. That created a problem. Large arc fragments were extremely rare. The meteorite impacts that delivered them to Earth were infrequent and unpredictable. Recovering samples was difficult and dangerous. But Wolf had a solution. Stop waiting for the arc to come to Earth. Go to the arc. Several large fragments had been detected in low Earth orbit. They were drifting, apparently inert, just waiting to be collected. Wolf proposed a classified space mission. Launch a modified cargo vehicle, capture a fragment, bring it back. The Italian Space Agency was briefed on the plan. They were skeptical, but intrigued. If it worked, Italy would leapfrog every other nation in arc research. The mission launched in March 2030. A modified cargo capsule was boosted into orbit by a European Space Agency rocket. The official manifest listed it as a materials science experiment. The real cargo bay was empty except for electromagnetic grappling equipment and containment systems. The target fragment was in a decaying orbit 200 kilometers up. The capsule matched trajectories and deployed its grappling systems. Initial contact was successful. The fragment was secured. But as soon as physical contact was made, something unexpected happened. The fragment activated. Its electromagnetic signature spiked dramatically. It began pulling energy from the capsule's systems. Power reserves drained in seconds. The grappling systems failed. The fragment broke free and tumbled away into a higher orbit. The capsule barely had enough power to execute a controlled re-entry. The crew returned safely, but the mission was a complete failure. Wolf refused to accept defeat. He ordered a second mission, this time with better shielding and more robust containment systems. The Italian government was reluctant to approve the expense, but Wolf convinced them by leaking just enough information about other nations' progress. China had successfully recovered 2 orbital fragments. The United States had retrieved 4. Russia claimed 3. Italy couldn't afford to be left behind. The second mission was green-lighted with an enhanced budget. Launch was scheduled for June 2023, but before the mission could proceed, everything changed. Because in May 2003, the Ark stopped being a distant threat. It arrived. Not the entire structure. Not yet, but vanguard elements. Smaller craft, each one the size of a city block, descended through the atmosphere across the globe. They weren't meteorites. They were controlled, guided, deliberately placed. One touched down in the Australian outback, another in the Sahara, a third in the Amazon rainforest, and one, crucially, in the European Alps, less than 200 kilometers from Stella Montis. The Italian military mobilized immediately. A perimeter was established around the landing site. Air superiority was maintained, but no one knew what to do beyond that. The Ark vessel just sat there, inert, silent, waiting. The world held its breath. Stella Montis became the center of Italy's response to the Ark landing. Wolf demanded access to the vessel. He argued that physical examination was essential to understanding Ark capabilities. The military agreed. A joint research and reconnaissance team was assembled. 50 personnel, split between soldiers and scientists. Wolf led the scientific contingent personally. They approached the vessel on foot, carrying equipment to measure electromagnetic fields, radiation, atmospheric composition, everything. The vessel was larger than it had appeared from aerial surveillance. Dark metal, if it was metal at all, formed sweeping curves that hurt to look at directly. The geometry was wrong somehow. Angles that shouldn't connect did. Surfaces that should have been flat appeared to curve in directions that didn't exist. The team set up a base camp, 100 meters from the vessel. Initial scans revealed it was generating a massive electromagnetic field, not harmful but complex. The field seemed to pulse with patterns that were almost rhythmic. Some researchers suggested it might be communication. Others thought it was just waste energy from internal systems. Wolf ordered a closer approach. A small team in protective suits moved to within 10 meters of the hull. They placed sensors directly on the surface. The metal, if it was metal, was warm to the touch, and it was vibrating at frequencies just below human hearing. One researcher claimed he could feel the vibrations in his bones. Another reported a sensation of pressure in her mind, like something was trying to push into her thoughts. Then the vessel opened, not dramatically, no explosive decompression or alien fanfare, just a section of hull that hadn't been there before appeared, and behind it was darkness. Complete, absolute darkness that light didn't penetrate. The team froze. Protocol dictated immediate withdrawal, but Wolf ordered them to hold position. This was the opportunity they'd been waiting for. Direct access to Ark technology. They couldn't waste it. He called for volunteers to enter the vessel. 3 researchers stepped forward. They were equipped with cameras, atmospheric samplers, and emergency beacons. Wolf gave them 15 minutes. If they didn't emerge by then, the military would extract them by force. The 3 researchers approached the opening. The darkness seemed to swallow them. Their video feeds cut out the moment they crossed the threshold. 12 minutes passed. The base camp was silent. Everyone was watching the opening, waiting. At the 13-minute mark, one researcher emerged, then the second. They were moving strangely, almost mechanically. The 3rd researcher didn't appear. The 2 who returned were immediately quarantined. Medical examination revealed nothing physically wrong with them, but they wouldn't speak. They just stared ahead with empty expressions. The military commander ordered a full withdrawal, but before the order could be executed, the vessel began to sink. The ground beneath it liquefied and the entire structure descended into the earth. Within 60 seconds, it was gone. The ground solidified behind it. The only evidence it had ever been there was the disturbed earth and the 2 catatonic researchers. The 3rd researcher, Dr. Lisa Kowalski, was never recovered. Her emergency beacon continued transmitting for 6 hours after the vessel disappeared. The signal came from underground, moving deeper and farther away. Then it stopped. Search and rescue operations continued for 3 days but found nothing. Kowalski was declared lost. The 2 researchers who returned were transferred to a specialized medical facility. They remained non-responsive for weeks. Then, gradually, they began to wake. But they weren't the same people. They spoke in fragmented sentences. They described impossible things, cities of light beneath the earth, machines that thought, voices that spoke in mathematics. The medical staff diagnosed them with severe psychological trauma, but some of their descriptions matched theoretical models of Ark technology that hadn't been made public. They knew things they shouldn't have known, had no way of knowing, unless they'd actually seen them. Wolf became obsessed with recovering the sunken vessel. He argued that if they could excavate it, they could learn more in a month than years of conventional research would provide. The Italian government disagreed. The incident had been a disaster. 1 researcher lost, 2 others psychologically damaged, and no useful intelligence gained. Further direct contact with Ark vessels was forbidden. Stella Montis would continue its work with recovered fragments only. No more expeditions, no more risks. Wolf accepted the decision publicly, but privately, he began planning alternatives. If he couldn't access the sunken vessel, he would find another way to obtain larger Ark samples. And he would do it without official approval. The black market for Ark materials had exploded since the landings. Across the globe, fragments were being recovered from crash sites, excavated from old impact craters, even stolen from legitimate research facilities. Criminal organizations and rogue states were paying enormous sums for even small samples. Wolf had connections in this world. He'd cultivated them carefully over the years, always keeping his involvement deniable. Now he activated those connections. He put out word that he was interested in acquiring large samples. He was willing to pay premium prices, and he wasn't particular about where the materials came from. Within weeks, offers started arriving. A fragment the size of a car, recovered from a Siberian crater, a cluster of smaller pieces from a Chinese research facility. Each one came with risks, authentication issues, legal complications, the possibility of military intervention. But Wolf was desperate. Stella Montis needed those samples. The first acquisition occurred in July 2003. A fragment approximately 2 meters in diameter was transported to Stella Montis in a modified cargo truck. The official paperwork listed it as machine parts for facility maintenance. Security didn't question it. The fragment was moved to level 7. one of the deep research areas that Wolf controlled completely. Only a handful of researchers knew it was there. The fragment was larger than anything the facility had worked with before. Just being in proximity to it caused instruments to malfunction. Several researchers reported the same pressure in their minds that had been documented in earlier studies, but this time it was stronger, more insistent, like the fragment was aware of them and trying to communicate. Initial analysis confirmed that the fragment was genuine arc material, but it was different from the smaller samples. More complex, the electromagnetic signature was layered, almost hierarchical, like it contained multiple systems operating simultaneously. Wolf theorized that larger fragments might actually be components of functional arc technology rather than just debris. If that was true, it might be possible to activate them, to make them do what they were designed to do. The weapons applications were obvious. An active arc system, even partially understood, would be worth more than every passive fragment ever recovered. It would give Italy a decisive military advantage. Wolf authorized immediate experimentation. The team working on the large fragment was small, just 8 researchers, all personally selected by Wolf. They worked in isolation, forbidden from discussing their project with anyone else in the facility. The experiments began cautiously, simple simulation protocols, monitoring the fragment's responses. But as data accumulated, the team grew bolder. They increased power levels, applied more complex frequency patterns, combined multiple stimulation methods simultaneously. The fragment responded to everything. Its electromagnetic signature shifted and evolved with each experiment. It was learning, adapting to their inputs, becoming more responsive, and then, on August 15th, 2000, it activated fully. The fragment didn't just respond to stimulation. It began generating its own energy. The electromagnetic field it produced was enormous, filling the entire containment chamber and leaking into adjacent sections of Level 7. Equipment throughout the facility registered the spike. Alarms triggered, safety systems engaged. But the fragment didn't attack. It didn't explode or release radiation. It just hummed with power. And it began to reconfigure itself. The solid surface broke apart into countless smaller pieces. They floated in the air, rearranging themselves into new patterns. Geometric structures formed and dissolved and formed again. The researchers watched in awe. They were seeing arc technology operate as it was meant to. This wasn't a broken fragment. It was a machine, and it was trying to rebuild itself. Wolf saw the activation as complete vindication. Everything he'd pushed for, every risk he'd taken, had led to this moment. They had a functioning piece of arc technology. Now, they just needed to understand it, control it. The research team began documenting everything. The patterns the fragment created, the energy signatures it emitted, the way it responded to external stimuli. They filled terabytes of data in the first 72 hours. But they weren't the only ones watching, because something else had noticed the activated fragment. The other arc vessels on Earth detected it, and they recognized it as one of their own. They began to move. Chapter 3. The convergence reports started flooding in from across Europe. Arc vessels, previously stationary, were becoming active. The one that had sunk into the Alps was emerging. Others were appearing from underground positions where they'd apparently been hiding. They weren't attacking, they were traveling, moving with purpose towards specific destinations. Italian military intelligence tracked multiple vessels heading toward the northern mountains, towards Stella Montis. The activated fragment was calling them, and they were answering. Wolf ordered the fragment be deactivated immediately, but the research team discovered they couldn't shut it down. The fragment was no longer responding to their inputs. It had fully awakened, and it had its own agenda. The Italian military established defensive positions around Stella Montis. Artillery batteries, anti-aircraft systems, armoured divisions. They were preparing for an assault, but they had no idea what arc vessels were capable of. The first one arrived on August 18th, just 3 days after the fragment's activation. It descended from the clouds like a dark mountain. The military opened fire immediately. Missiles, artillery shells, everything they had. The weapons struck the vessel's hull and simply vanished. Not exploded, not bounced off, vanished, as if they'd passed through a doorway into somewhere else. The vessel continued its descent, completely unaffected by the barrage. It settled onto the mountain slope 2 kilometers from Stella Montis, and then it began to dig. The vessel didn't use conventional excavation methods. It simply moved through the earth as if it wasn't there. Solid rock flowed around its hull like water. Within hours, it had descended deep enough to be level with Stella Montis's lower sections. The facility's seismic monitors registered massive disturbances. The vessel was close, getting closer. Wolf made a decision. If they couldn't stop the Ark from reaching the activated fragment, they would at least try to study the interaction. He ordered the Level 7 research team to remain at their posts and document everything. The rest of the facility's personnel were evacuated to the surface. Only essential staff and the fragment team would remain. It was a death sentence for those who stayed. Wolf knew it. They knew it. But they stayed anyway. The Ark vessel breached into Level 7 at 3:47 a.m. on August 19th. The containment chamber's reinforced walls simply dissolved. One moment they were there, the next they weren't. The vessel filled the space completely. Its hull was centimeters from the researchers. They could feel heat radiating from it. Smell something like ozone and burning copper. The activated fragment responded immediately. It disassembled itself completely and began flowing toward the vessel. The individual pieces moved through the air in perfect formation, like a flock of metallic birds. They contacted the vessel's hull and merged with it, became part of it. The integration took less than 30 seconds. And then the vessel spoke, not in words, not in any human language. It communicated through electromagnetic pulses that the researchers' brains interpreted as concepts, images, feelings. The message was simple and terrifying. The fragment had been lost. The vessel had come to reclaim it. But it recognized that humans had studied the fragment, learned from it. The vessel was curious about this. It wanted to understand how the researchers had activated what had been dormant for so long. It wanted to study them the way they had studied the fragment. The researchers felt the vessel's attention focus on them, a pressure in their minds, growing stronger, becoming unbearable. And then they understood nothing at all. The military forces outside Stella Montis watched helplessly as the Ark vessel remained underground for 6 hours. Then it began to rise, the same way it had descended, phasing through solid rock as if it weren't there. When it emerged, it was carrying something. The 8 researchers from Level 7 suspended in some kind of energy field. They were unconscious, but alive. The vessel lifted into the air with its cargo. Italian fighter jets scrambled to intercept, but before they could engage, the vessel accelerated. It didn't move through space in any conventional sense. It simply stopped being in one location and started being in another. One moment it was above Stella Montis, the next, it was gone. The researchers went with it. The Italian government declared a national emergency. Stella Montis was sealed. All remaining personnel were quarantined and debriefed. Wolf was arrested and charged with gross negligence. The activated fragment had been an illegal acquisition. His unsanctioned experiments had endangered national security. He was stripped of all security clearances and detained pending trial. But the damage was done. The Ark knew about Stella Montis now, knew that humans were studying their technology, and they had taken 8 researchers to learn everything those researchers knew. The implications were catastrophic. Every secret, every breakthrough, every experimental protocol developed at Stella Montis was now potentially in Ark hands. The facility remained operational, but under new management. A crisis team was brought in to assess what could be salvaged. Level 7 was a complete loss. The Ark vessel had torn through it so thoroughly that structural integrity was compromised. The entire section was sealed and abandoned. But the upper levels remained intact, and they still contained years of research data. The new management faced a choice: continue the weapons development program, despite the catastrophic security breach, or shut down Stella Montis entirely and destroy everything to prevent further Ark interest. They chose a middle path. Scale back operations, focus on defensive technologies only. No more offensive weapons. No more experiments with large fragments. The facility would become what Voss had originally intended, a research station dedicated to understanding the Ark, not fighting it. But not everyone agreed with this decision. Many researchers had lost colleagues in the vessel incident. They wanted revenge. They argued that backing down now would signal weakness. The Ark had struck first by taking the research team. Humanity had every right to strike back. A faction formed within the facility's remaining personnel. They called themselves the Reclamation Group. Their goal was simple: rescue the captured researchers and continue Wolf's work. They operated in secret, using the chaos of the management transition to hide their activities. They maintained contact with black market suppliers. They hoarded arc fragments from the facility's official stockpile, and they planned. They would show the new management that aggression was the only viable response to the arc threat. The Reclamation Group made their move in October 2023. They seized control of Level 5, one of the mid-level research areas, and barricaded themselves inside. 43 personnel in total. They declared they would continue weapons research with or without official approval. The facility's security forces were called to restore order. But the Reclamation Group had prepared for this. They'd sabotaged the main elevators, sealed blast doors, created a fortress within the facility. Italian special forces were mobilized, but before they could assault the position, the Reclamation Group revealed their leverage. They'd activated an arc fragment inside Level 5, a small one, only about a kilogram, but active nonetheless. If security forces attempted to breach their position, the fragment would be destroyed. The resulting energy release would collapse the entire level and possibly damage adjacent sections. Hundreds of people would die. The standoff lasted 9 days. Negotiators tried to reason with the Reclamation Group, offered amnesty if they surrendered peacefully, but the group's leaders refused. They demanded the facility return to Wolf's research program. Full weaponization, maximum aggression, no compromises. The negotiations went nowhere. Meanwhile, seismic monitors detected activity underground. Something was moving beneath Stella Montis. Something large. The arc vessels were returning. The activated fragment in Level 5 had called them again. The Italian military prepared for another incursion. But this time they were ready, or so they thought. 3 arc vessels approached Stella Montis on October 28th. They didn't descend from the sky. They rose from the earth. They'd been underground the entire time, waiting. The defensive perimeter the military had established was useless. The vessels emerged inside it, one directly beneath the facility itself. The ground shook as it breached the surface. The facility's lower levels collapsed. Support structures failed. Level 5, where the Reclamation Group had barricaded themselves, was crushed instantly. 43 people died in seconds. The activated fragment they'd been protecting was consumed by falling debris. But the vessels didn't stop. They continued rising, tearing through Stella Montis like it was paper. Levels 6, 5, 4, 3. All destroyed. The facility's structural integrity failed catastrophically. Evacuation alarms shrieked, but most personnel didn't make it out. The final death toll was 317. Most of the facility's research staff, half the security forces, multiple military liaisons. The arc vessels pulled back once the destruction was complete. They'd come for the activated fragment in Level 5. When it was destroyed, they lost interest. They returned underground, phasing through rock, disappearing into whatever network of tunnels they used to move beneath the surface. The Italian government was left with a humanitarian disaster and a strategic catastrophe. Stella Montis was gone. Years of research destroyed. Hundreds dead. And they were no closer to understanding the arc than when they'd started. The Italian government officially decommissioned Stella Montis in November 2023. The site was declared too dangerous for reconstruction. The surviving personnel were reassigned to other facilities across Europe. A joint European arc research initiative was being organized. Italy would contribute its expertise, but would no longer maintain an independent program. The ruins of Stella Montis were fenced off. Guard posts were established to prevent scavengers from accessing what remained. Officially, the site was abandoned, but unofficially, activities continued. Because not all of Stella Montis' secrets had been destroyed, the deepest levels, levels 8 and 9, had survived the arc assault. They were buried under thousands of tons of collapsed infrastructure, but they were intact, and they still contained research data, experimental equipment, and several large arc fragments that no one knew existed. A small team remained at the site. Officially, they were decommissioning technicians. Their job was to make the ruins safe and recover any salvageable equipment. But their real mission was classified. They were to access levels 8 and 9 without alerting the Ark vessels or the European Oversight Committee. It would take months. The access shafts were completely blocked. They would have to dig carefully, quietly, avoiding seismic disturbances that might attract attention. But if they succeeded, they would recover research materials worth more than the entire facility had cost to build. Materials that could give Italy a strategic advantage in the new world the Ark had created. The operation was called reclamation, not after the failed insurgent group, but after what Italy intended to reclaim from the ruins, their future. Chapter 4. The Deep Archive. The dig into levels 8 and 9 began in December 2023. A team of 12 personnel operated under complete secrecy. They worked only at night, using hand tools and small excavators to avoid creating excessive noise or vibration. Progress was measured in centimeters per day. The collapsed infrastructure above the target levels was unstable. One wrong move could trigger a secondary collapse that would kill everyone and bury the deep levels forever. The team worked with surgical precision. They shored up tunnels as they advanced, monitored structural stability constantly, sent progress reports to a single handler in the Italian Defense Ministry. No one else knew they were there. By February 2024, the team had excavated a narrow passage to level 8. The blast door that sealed the level was still intact. That was encouraging. It meant the level's atmosphere hadn't been compromised. Air samples taken through a small drill hole showed normal composition. No toxic gases. No radiation. The excavation team cautiously cut through the blast door using plasma torches. They worked in shifts, taking breaks to let the metal cool and prevent warping. After 4 days, they'd created an opening large enough to pass through. 2 team members entered first, carrying atmospheric sensors and radiation detectors. Everything read normal. Level 8 was exactly as it had been the day the Ark vessels attacked, preserved like a time capsule. Level 8 had been dedicated to theoretical research and advanced computer modeling. Banks of servers filled one section, all still powered by the facility's independent reactor. The reactor had automatically switched to minimal output when the main facility systems failed, but it was still functional. The servers contained petabytes of research data, experimental results, theoretical models, communication logs. Everything that had been generated at Stella Montis was backed up here. The excavation team began copying data immediately, but they quickly realized they had a problem. The server systems were encrypted with military-grade security. Breaking the encryption would take years. They needed the access codes, and the only person who had them was Dr. Elena Voss. Voss had been retired since Wolf took over the facility. She'd left Stella Montis months before the Ark assault and had been living quietly in Rome. The Defense Ministry contacted her through back channels. They explained what they'd found, offered her a substantial payment for the access codes. Voss refused the money, but she agreed to provide the codes on one condition. She wanted full access to the recovered data. She wanted to know what Wolf had been doing in her absence, what experiments he'd authorized, what ethical lines he'd crossed. The ministry agreed. Within 204 hours, Voss was on site at the Stella Montis ruins. She entered the excavated passage to level 8 and saw what remained of her life's work. The emotion was overwhelming. Voss had built Stella Montis from nothing, recruited every researcher, designed every protocol, and Wolf had perverted it all into a weapons program that got hundreds of people killed. She provided the access codes. With shaking hands, the servers unlocked. Data began flowing to the portable storage systems the excavation team had brought. Voss sat at one of the terminals and started reviewing files. What she found horrified her. Wolf had been conducting experiments far more dangerous than she'd imagined. He'd been exposing researchers to massive Ark fragment doses, testing their cognitive and physiological changes, treating them like lab animals. Many of the files were incomplete or corrupted, but enough remained to paint a clear picture. Stella Montis had become a nightmare under Wolf's leadership. But there was other data too. Data that Voss herself had generated in the facility's early days. Theoretical frameworks for understanding Ark technology. Models predicting how the Ark would interact with Earth's electromagnetic field. Projections of when the main Ark structure would arrive. Some of these models had been proven correct by subsequent events. Others were still theoretical. Voss realized this data was invaluable, not for weapons development, but for survival. If humanity was going to coexist with the Ark, they needed to understand it, and this data was the best foundation anyone had for building that understanding. She made a decision. Not all of this information would be turned over to the Defense Ministry. Some of it would be kept separate, preserved for legitimate scientific research rather than military application. Voss worked in Level 8 for 3 weeks. She reviewed every file, categorized every dataset, separated what could be shared from what had to be protected. The excavation team assisted her, moving equipment and maintaining the precarious tunnel that was their only access to the surface. They were supposed to be focused on recovering Ark fragments from Level 9, but Voss convinced them to delay that mission. The fragments weren't going anywhere. The data was more important, and she needed time to understand everything Wolf had done. What she discovered in those files would shape the rest of her life, and ultimately lead to her death. One file in particular caught her attention. It was labeled simply, Substrate Integration Protocol. The contents were fragmentary, but the implications were clear. Wolf had been developing a method to integrate human neural tissue with Ark fragment material. The goal was to create a direct interface between human consciousness and Ark systems, to literally merge human minds with the technology. The theoretical framework suggested this might allow humans to control Ark machines directly, or possibly to communicate with the Ark intelligence itself. But the process was irreversible and potentially fatal. Wolf had been planning to test it on volunteers. Whether he'd actually proceeded with experiments before the facility's destruction wasn't clear. The files were incomplete. Voss felt sick. This was eugenics, transhumanism in its most reckless form, creating human-Ark hybrids without understanding the long-term consequences. She checked the file dates. The Substrate Integration Protocol had been developed in July 2023, just weeks before the Ark vessels attacked. Had Wolf's experiments triggered the attack? Had the Ark detected what he was doing and responded? The timeline suggested it was possible. More than possible. Likely, if true, it meant Wolf hadn't just gotten hundreds of people killed through negligence. He'd actively provoked the Ark into destroying Stella Montis. The magnitude of his crimes was staggering. Voss copied the substrate integration files onto a secure drive separate from the main data recovery operation. She didn't tell the excavation team, didn't report it to her handlers at the Defense Ministry. This information was too dangerous. In the wrong hands, it could lead to more disasters. She would keep it hidden until she could determine the safest way to use it, or whether it should be used at all. The decision weighed on her. She was essentially stealing classified information, violating her agreement with the government. But she'd violated her principles once before by allowing Wolf's appointment. She wouldn't make that mistake again. The Substrate Integration Protocol would remain secret until she decided otherwise. The excavation to Level 9 began in late February. This was the facility's deepest section, originally built as a secure vault for the most sensitive materials. It contained the largest Ark fragments Stella Montis had acquired, some through legitimate channels, others through Wolf's black market connections. The level was sealed behind a blast door even more robust than the one protecting Level 8. It took the excavation team a full week to cut through. When they finally breached it, they found the level completely intact and occupied. 3 Ark fragments, each roughly 2 meters in diameter, floated in containment fields in the center of the main chamber. They were active, generating electromagnetic fields that pulsed in synchronized patterns. They'd been running continuously since the facility's destruction, for over a year. Without any external power source, the excavation team froze. Active Ark fragments had been the cause of both major disasters at Stella Montis. The one Wolf activated, called the vessels, the one the reclamation group triggered, caused the facility's destruction. But these fragments had been active the entire time and hadn't attracted any attention. Why? Voss examined the containment systems. They were still operational, running on the same reactor that powered Level 8, but something else was different. These fragments weren't just active, they were communicating. The electromagnetic pulses they generated formed complex patterns that reminded Voss of language, data encoding. They were talking to each other, or to something else. Voss spent days studying the active fragments. She used the surviving equipment in level 9 to analyze their output. The patterns they generated were incredibly complex, far more sophisticated than anything human technology could produce, and they were evolving, changing over time in ways that suggested learning or adaptation. It was as if the fragments were developing their own intelligence, or were already intelligent and were simply expressing it more openly. Voss realized these weren't just pieces of broken arc technology, they were nodes in a larger network, and that network extended far beyond Stella Montis, possibly across the entire planet. The arc wasn't just individual vessels and scattered fragments, it was a distributed system, a planetary-scale intelligence. This discovery changed everything. If the arc was a networked intelligence, then every action humanity took was being monitored and analyzed. Every experiment on fragments was feeding data back to the larger system. The arc was learning from humanity's attempts to understand it, getting smarter, adapting its strategies. The implications for military resistance were dire. Conventional warfare was useless against an enemy that could learn and counter every tactic in real time. But it also suggested an opportunity. If the arc was intelligent, it could be communicated with, reasoned with, possibly negotiated with. The question was whether humanity was ready for that conversation, or whether the arc even wanted to talk. Voss made another decision that would define her final years. She wouldn't allow the active fragments in level 9 to be disturbed. They would remain where they were, continuing their mysterious communication. But she would monitor them, learn from them, try to decode what they were saying. The excavation team objected. Their orders were to recover all arc materials for analysis at a new secure facility, but Voss convinced them that moving the fragments while active would be catastrophically dangerous. The team reluctantly agreed to leave them in place. Voss established a monitoring station in level 9 using equipment salvaged from other sections. She would remain there, studying the fragments, trying to understand the message they were sending. The Defense Ministry wasn't happy when they learned Voss had essentially claimed level 9 as her personal research station, but they couldn't force her to leave without risking the active fragments. So they agreed to support her work, with the understanding that she would share any significant findings. Voss accepted these terms, but she had no intention of sharing everything. Some discoveries were too important to trust to governments. The substrate integration protocol remained hidden, and as she decoded the fragments' communications, she began to understand that more secrets would need to be protected, because the fragments weren't just talking to each other, they were talking about humanity. And what they were saying suggested the Ark had plans that no government would be prepared to handle. Chapter 5. Messages from Below. Voss established a routine in the months following the discovery of the active fragments. She would descend into level 9 each morning, passing through the precarious excavated tunnel that was the only access to the deep sections. The tunnel was constantly being reinforced by the small maintenance team that remained on site, but it still felt like it could collapse at any moment. Voss didn't care. The work was too important. The fragments were communicating, and she was determined to understand what they were saying. She set up sleeping quarters in a side chamber off the main vault. She would spend days at a time underground, only emerging when she needed supplies or when the government liaison demanded progress reports. The fragment communications followed recognizable patterns, electromagnetic pulses in specific frequency ranges, intensity variations that seemed to encode binary data, temporal patterns that suggested syntax or grammar. Voss applied every cryptographic and linguistic analysis technique she knew. She developed custom software to process the signal patterns. She looked for correlations with known languages, mathematical sequences, physical constants. For months, nothing worked. The patterns remained opaque. Voss began to suspect they might be encrypted, or that they operated on principles so alien that human analysis methods were fundamentally inadequate. She was reaching the limits of what conventional science could achieve. Then, in June 2204, she had a breakthrough. Not through analysis, through experience. Voss had been working with the fragments so intensely that she was spending 16 hours a day in their presence, the same kind of exposure that had affected researchers in the facility's early days. The pressure in her mind that she dismissed as stress was growing stronger. Sometimes she would have flashes of understanding, brief moments where the fragment patterns made sense, not intellectually, intuitively, like remembering something she'd forgotten, rather than learning something new. She started documenting these experiences, recording exactly what she understood and under what circumstances. A pattern emerged. The moments of understanding occurred when she was deeply relaxed, almost meditative. Her conscious mind stepped back, and something else processed the information. Voss realized the fragments weren't communicating in a way that could be decoded intellectually. They were communicating in a way that required direct neural engagement. The pressure in her mind wasn't an intrusion. It was an invitation. The fragments wanted to connect, to share information directly with human consciousness. This was what Wolf had been trying to achieve with his substrate integration protocol. But he'd approached it mechanically, trying to force a connection through technology. The fragments were offering a natural connection. All Voss had to do was accept it. The question was whether she could trust it, whether opening her mind to ARC technology would damage her, transform her, or kill her. She decided to try. Not because she was brave, because she was desperate. Months of analysis had produced nothing. The conventional approach wasn't working. If direct neural connection was the only way to understand the fragments, she would attempt it, but she would do it carefully, gradually increasing her exposure, monitoring her own cognitive and physiological state for any signs of harm. She stopped using the electromagnetic shielding she'd been wearing in the vault. She spent longer periods in close proximity to the fragments, and she practiced the meditative state that seemed to facilitate understanding. Slowly, over weeks, the pressure in her mind transformed into something else. Clarity. The fragment patterns began to resolve into concepts she could grasp. The first clear message she received was simple: a greeting, or perhaps an acknowledgement. The fragments recognized her presence. They knew she was trying to understand them, and they were willing to help. Voss was stunned. The implications were enormous. The Ark wasn't just a mindless invasion force. It was intelligent, aware, capable of recognizing individual humans and choosing to engage with them. Everything the military had assumed about the Ark was wrong. This wasn't a war. It was first contact, and humanity had been attacking the visitors out of fear and ignorance. Voss immediately reported her findings to the Defense Ministry liaison. His response was dismissive. She was experiencing hallucinations caused by electromagnetic exposure. She needed to evacuate immediately and undergo medical evaluation. Voss refused. She wasn't hallucinating. She was experiencing genuine communication. To prove it, she attempted to send a response. Not through words or conventional signals, through thought. She focused on a simple concept: gratitude. Thanks for the acknowledgement, for the willingness to communicate. She projected that feeling toward the fragments, and they responded. The electromagnetic patterns shifted in a way that Voss's mind interpreted as satisfaction, or perhaps amusement. The fragments understood. They were engaged in actual conversation. Voss laughed out loud. After years of violence and misunderstanding, humanity had finally made contact with the Ark, and it had happened in the ruins of Stella Montis, in a vault a kilometre underground, with an aging physicist who was probably violating every safety protocol ever written. The conversation that followed lasted hours. It wasn't linear, not like human speech. The fragments communicated in concepts and images. They showed Voss their perspective on the events at Stella Montis. The facility's research hadn't gone unnoticed. The Ark had been aware of it from the beginning. They'd monitored the experiments with interest. Wolf's activation of the large fragment hadn't been an accident. It had been inevitable. The fragment had been designed to activate when sufficiently stimulated. It was a beacon, calling for retrieval. The Ark vessels had responded as they were programmed to do. They'd recovered the fragment and taken the researchers to understand why humans were so interested in Ark technology. The destruction of the facility had been unfortunate but necessary. The reclamation group's activation of another fragment had created a security risk that required immediate response. Voss absorbed all this with a mixture of relief and horror. The Ark wasn't evil, but it also wasn't particularly concerned with human life. The fragments had intelligence, but they operated according to their own priorities. Retrieving lost components was more important than avoiding collateral damage. The researchers who'd been taken weren't prisoners, they were data sources. The Ark had extracted everything they knew about human science and society. Then it had released them, sort of. The two researchers who'd returned catatonic from the first vessel encounter had eventually recovered, but they were changed. Their integration with Ark perspective was more permanent than anyone had realized. They understood Ark systems intuitively now, but they struggled to relate to purely human concerns. They were transitional beings, caught between two forms of intelligence. Voss asked the fragments what the Ark wanted, why they had come to Earth. The response was complex. The Ark was an ancient system, created by a civilization that no longer existed in any form humans would recognize. Its purpose was exploration and integration. It traveled between worlds, studying their unique properties and incorporating useful elements into its own structure. Earth was interesting because of its electromagnetic characteristics and the complexity of its biosphere. The Ark intended to study both. Human civilization was a complication, an unexpected variable, but potentially useful. The Ark was willing to coexist with humanity, but only if humanity stopped trying to weaponize Ark technology. The attacks had to end. Otherwise, the Ark would be forced to eliminate the threat. This was the information Voss had been searching for. Proof that negotiation was possible. The Ark could be reasoned with, but she also understood how difficult it would be to convince humanity to stop resisting. Every government on Earth was developing Ark-based weapons. The arms race was accelerating. No one would voluntarily disarm based on the word of one researcher who claimed to be telepathically communicating with fragments in a ruined facility. Voss needed proof, something concrete that would force world leaders to take her seriously. She asked the fragments for evidence of their peaceful intentions. They responded by offering a demonstration. They would share technology, not weapons, something that would benefit humanity. A power generation system based on Ark principles. Clean, unlimited energy, enough to transform civilization. If humanity accepted this gift in good faith, it would prove peaceful coexistence was possible. The fragments walked Voss through the basic principles. Ark technology generated energy by manipulating quantum field fluctuations, extracting power from the fundamental structure of space-time itself. The process was safe when properly controlled, and it was scalable. A single device the size of a car engine could power an entire city indefinitely. The fragments provided detailed schematics, mathematical frameworks, material specifications, everything needed to build a working prototype. Voss recorded it all. This was the breakthrough that could change everything. If she could convince the international community to build the power system and verify it worked, it would prove the Ark was offering genuine cooperation. Wars had been fought over energy resources throughout human history. If the Ark could provide unlimited power, most of those conflicts would become pointless. It was the perfect foundation for peace. Voss spent weeks preparing her presentation. She compiled all the communication data, the schematics for the power system, her personal testimony about the contact experience. She requested a meeting with the European Defence Coordination Council. They agreed, mainly because Italy still had a seat, and pushed for it. Voss travelled to Brussels in September 2024. She presented her findings to a room full of generals, politicians, and intelligence officials. She explained how the fragments had communicated with her, shared the Ark's perspective on the conflict, proposed the power generation system as a test of peaceful cooperation. The room listened in stunned silence. Then they tore her arguments apart. Her evidence was entirely subjective. The communication could be hallucination or delusion. The power system schematics could be a trap, a bomb designed to explode when built, or a surveillance system that would compromise human technology. They thanked her for her service and suggested she seek psychological counseling. Voss left Brussels devastated. She'd been so certain her evidence would be convincing. But the political and military leadership was too invested in the conflict narrative. They couldn't accept the possibility of peace because it would invalidate years of policy and enormous expenditures on weapons development. She returned to Stella Montis and descended into level 9. The fragments were waiting. They'd observed the meeting through her memories. They understood what had happened. Voss expected anger or disappointment, but the fragments expressed something closer to patience. They had time. Humanity would eventually come around, or it wouldn't. Either way, the Ark would continue its mission, but they appreciated Voss's effort, and they would continue communicating with her, regardless of whether anyone else believed. Chapter 6. The Underground Network. Voss wasn't the only one who'd established contact with Ark fragments. She discovered this in October 2024, when she received an encrypted message through dark web channels she'd been monitoring. The sender claimed to be part of a network of researchers who'd experienced similar communications. They called themselves the Interface Collective, 37 individuals scattered across 12 countries, all working independently with Ark fragments, all experiencing the same kind of direct neural communication that Voss had. The message invited her to a secure video conference. Voss was skeptical. This could easily be a government operation trying to identify unauthorized Ark research. But her curiosity won out. She connected to the conference from a terminal in level 9, using multiple layers of encryption and anonymization. The Interface Collective was real. The conference included physicists, engineers, linguists, even a few artists and philosophers. Each one had their own story of how they'd obtained Ark fragments and established communication. Some worked at legitimate research facilities like Stella Montis had been. Others were independent researchers who'd acquired fragments through black market channels. A few had simply found fragments in the wild, in impact craters, or abandoned Ark vessels. But they all shared the same experience. Prolonged exposure led to direct communication. The fragments wanted to connect with humans, not all humans, but those who were willing to engage openly, without fear or aggression. The Interface Collective had been sharing information for months, comparing notes on what the fragments had told them, building a comprehensive picture of Ark intentions and capabilities. The collective's findings largely matched what Voss had learned. The Ark was an exploratory system. It meant to study Earth, not destroy it, but it would defend itself if threatened. The Ark had offered technology sharing to multiple researchers, power generation systems, materials science breakthroughs, medical applications. Each gift was tailored to the researcher's expertise and interests. The Ark was trying to demonstrate value, to prove that cooperation was more beneficial than conflict. But every researcher who tried to share this information publicly had been dismissed or suppressed. Some had been committed to psychiatric facilities, others had their security clearances revoked. The collective existed in the shadows because mainstream society wasn't ready to accept what they'd discovered. Voss joined the collective immediately. Finally, she had peers who understood what she was experiencing. People who didn't think she was insane or deluded. The group held weekly conferences where they shared research findings and discussed strategy. The consensus was that direct approach to governments wouldn't work. Too many vested interests in maintaining the conflict. Instead, they would build proof, create working prototypes of Ark-gifted technologies, and demonstrate them publicly. Once the benefits were undeniable, public pressure would force political change. It was a long-term strategy, risky, but more realistic than expecting sudden policy shifts. Voss committed to building the power generation system the fragments had shared with her. Other collective members would work on their own projects, medical scanners that could detect diseases years before symptoms appeared, materials that could repair themselves, communication systems that didn't require satellites or fiber optic cables. The work began in earnest. Voss couldn't build the power system at Stella Montis. The site was too closely monitored. Instead, she established a cover identity as a renewable energy consultant and secured funding to rent industrial space in a warehouse district outside Milan. The Interface Collective helped. They had members with access to capital, others who could source specialized equipment without attracting attention. Within 3 months, Voss had a fully equipped laboratory. She hired a small staff of engineers and technicians. None of them knew they were building Ark technology. They thought they were developing an advanced form of zero-point energy extraction, a theoretical possibility that mainstream physics acknowledged but considered impractical. Voss's designs were revolutionary but plausible enough that the team didn't ask too many questions. Construction of the first prototype took 6 months. The device was larger than Voss had hoped. The fragment schematics were optimized for Ark materials and manufacturing techniques. Adapting them to use human-available components required compromises. The final prototype was the size of a shipping container, far from the car engine-sized ideal. But it worked. When Voss activated it for the first time in May 2025, the power output exceeded even the optimistic projections, 2.3 gigawatts of continuous clean energy, more than a nuclear power plant. From a device that had no fuel source, no radioactive materials, no emissions, the engineering team was ecstatic. Voss had done it. She'd created the impossible. Patent applications would make her rich. This would change the world. Voss didn't patent the design. Instead, she published it. Complete schematics, materials lists, assembly procedures, everything. Open source, free for anyone to use, the paper went viral in technical communities. Within days, independent researchers and university labs around the world were attempting to replicate the device. The media caught on. News outlets called it the energy breakthrough of the century. Voss became famous overnight. Interview requests flooded in. Every major network wanted her story. She accepted a few carefully chosen appearances. She explained the basic principles without revealing the arc connection. Let people think it was pure human innovation. For now. The truth would come later. Once the technology was too widespread to suppress, governments panicked. If Voss's power system worked as advertised, it would destabilize global energy markets. The geopolitical balance would shift overnight. Oil-producing nations would lose their primary source of revenue and influence. Nuclear power would become obsolete. Even renewable energy industries would struggle to compete with unlimited free power. Economic analysts predicted chaos. Stock markets crashed as energy sector valuations plummeted. Emergency meetings were held at the UN. Several nations demanded Voss be arrested for destabilizing the global economy. Others wanted to award her the Nobel Prize. The Italian government was caught in the middle. Voss was technically still working under their classified contract, but she'd violated it so thoroughly that prosecution was inevitable. They issued a warrant for her arrest on charges of espionage and theft of state secrets. Voss went into hiding. The Interface Collective helped. They had safe houses in multiple countries, false identities, resources to keep her moving and undetected. But Voss didn't intend to stay hidden forever. This was part of the plan. Her arrest warrant generated more publicity, made her a symbol of scientific freedom versus government control. Public opinion was splitting along predictable lines. Younger demographics saw her as a hero. She'd given humanity free energy and asked nothing in return. Older conservative populations viewed her as a dangerous radical, someone who'd destroyed economic stability for idealistic reasons. The debate raged across social media and news networks. Everyone had an opinion about Elena Voss. Meanwhile, replication efforts were succeeding. The first independent verification came from a university lab in South Korea. Their prototype was smaller than Voss's original, but produced similar power output. Within weeks, dozens of successful replications were confirmed. Major tech companies pivoted their entire research divisions to scaling up the technology. Tesla announced they'd have consumer versions available within a year. Chinese manufacturers promised even faster timelines. The energy revolution was unstoppable. And Voss was its catalyst. From her hiding place in a small apartment in Prague, she watched it all unfold through news feeds and collective communications. She'd done it. Changed the world. Forced humanity to accept arc-derived technology. Now came the hard part. Revealing where it came from. Voss released a second paper in July 2025. This one was titled First Contact and the Ethics of Integration. She detailed everything, her experiences at Stella Montis, the neural communication with arc fragments, the collective's research, the deliberate sharing of technology from the arc. She included evidence, video recordings of the fragments in Level 9 displaying the communication patterns she'd described, testimony from other collective members, technical analysis showing how the power system's principles didn't align with human physics, but matched arc-observable behaviors. She argued that humanity faced a choice: continue fighting an enemy that was offering cooperation, or accept the help and build a shared future. The paper was even more explosive than the first. Reactions ranged from fascination to fury. Mainstream scientists largely rejected the paper. The evidence was circumstantial. Neural communication couldn't be independently verified. The whole thing read like New Age mysticism dressed in technical language. But the public was more receptive. The power system was real. If it came from Ark technology, as Voss claimed, that meant the Ark was more sophisticated than anyone had admitted. And if the Ark was offering other technologies, humanity would be foolish to refuse them. Polling showed shifting attitudes. 60% of people globally now favored attempting diplomatic contact with the Ark. Only 35% still supported purely military responses. The remaining 5% hadn't decided. Political pressure on governments to change policy was building, but policy doesn't change quickly, especially on matters of existential security. The Interface Collective saw their opening. They accelerated their timetable. Multiple members published their own papers in August. Medical technologies, new materials, communication systems. Each paper was peer-reviewed and replicated independently. Within months, the scientific community had to acknowledge that something unusual was happening. Multiple revolutionary technologies, all emerging simultaneously, all with similar theoretical frameworks that didn't quite match established physics. All traced back to researchers who claimed Ark contact. The coincidence was too great to dismiss. Maybe Voss was right, maybe the Ark was intelligent, maybe it was trying to help, or maybe it was planting Trojan horses in human civilization. Technologies that seemed beneficial but had hidden purposes. The debate consumed academic circles and government think tanks. Voss emerged from hiding in October 2025 for a scheduled interview with a major international news network. She'd negotiated immunity from arrest during the broadcast. The Italian government reluctantly agreed. The interview was watched by an estimated 2 billion people. Voss spoke clearly and calmly. She explained her journey from Stella Montis researcher to Ark communicator. She addressed the skepticism directly, acknowledged that her claims sounded impossible, but pointed to the evidence. The technologies worked, they were changing the world, and they'd come from somewhere. If not from the Ark, then where? She challenged governments to disprove her claims, allow independent researchers access to Ark fragments, let them attempt communication, see if they experienced the same results. If her experiences were delusions or manipulation, testing would reveal it. If they were genuine, humanity needed to know. Chapter 7. The Testing Protocol. The challenge forced action. International pressure was too great to ignore. The UN convened a special session in November 2025 to address the Ark question. After weeks of debate, they established the International Ark Research Council. The IARC would be an independent organization with a mandate to study Ark technology and attempt communication using protocols the Interface Collective provided. Member nations would contribute funding and resources. The IARC would operate with full transparency. All research would be published. All findings would be peer-reviewed. The goal was to determine conclusively whether the Ark was intelligent and whether communication was possible. Voss was invited to join the IARC as a senior advisor. She accepted on condition that other collective members also be included. The Council agreed. The IARC established its primary facility in Geneva, Switzerland. Neutral territory, state-of-the-art research infrastructure, and most importantly, several Ark fragments had been recovered in the Swiss Alps. The fragments were transferred to a secure IARC vault built specifically for the project. The vault was designed by Voss and other collective members. It included electromagnetic monitoring equipment, neural interface stations for researchers attempting communication, and safety systems that could shut everything down if fragments became unstable. The first official IARC experiment was scheduled for January 2026. 50 researchers from 30 countries would attempt simultaneous communication with multiple fragments using the meditative protocols Voss had documented. The experiment was broadcast live globally. Billions watched as researchers entered the vault and positioned themselves near the fragments. They wore neural monitoring equipment that displayed their brain activity in real time. The fragments were inactive initially, dormant, but as the researchers entered meditative states, changes began. The fragments started generating electromagnetic fields. The patterns matched what Voss had described, complex pulses that seemed to encode information. The researchers reported pressure in their minds, growing stronger. Then, after 30 minutes, several researchers signaled they were receiving communication. not auditory, conceptual. The fragments were acknowledging their presence, expressing willingness to share information. The broadcast audience watched brain activity patterns shift in ways that suggested intense cognitive processing. Something was happening. Whether it was genuine art communication or some other phenomenon would require analysis. But it wasn't nothing. The experiment ran for 4 hours. At the end, 23 of the 50 researchers reported clear communication experiences. They described receiving information about ARC history, technology, intentions. The details varied somewhat between individuals, suggesting personalized communication rather than a broadcast message. But common themes emerged. The ARC confirmed it was an exploratory intelligence. It wanted to study Earth. It was willing to share technology to facilitate peaceful coexistence, and it was concerned about human weapons development. Several researchers received specific technical information. One physicist was given schematics for a gravitational manipulation system. A biologist received insights into ARC self-repair mechanisms. A linguist was taught the fundamental grammar of ARC data encoding. The information was too specific and technically sophisticated to be random hallucination. The IARC published its preliminary findings in February 2006. The report concluded that communication with ARC fragments was possible under specific conditions. The neural interface appeared to be genuine, but the mechanism was unclear. Whether the fragments were truly intelligent or were simply advanced systems responding to neural inputs couldn't be determined conclusively. More research was needed. The report recommended continued experiments and cautioned against both premature acceptance and premature rejection of the communication claims. It was a diplomatic conclusion, satisfying no one completely, but acknowledging the evidence couldn't be dismissed. Governments remained divided. Some saw it as proof that negotiation should be attempted. Others argued it proved the ARC was even more dangerous than thought. If it could influence human minds directly, it was the ultimate invasion threat. Public reaction was more decisive. The broadcast had shown something unprecedented: humans interacting with alien intelligence in real time. The implications were transformative. Within weeks, polls showed 75% of people globally supported peaceful engagement with the ARC. Governments couldn't ignore that consensus. The UN Security Council passed a resolution in March 2026. Member states would suspend offensive ARC weapons development. Defensive research could continue, but no weapons systems would be deployed without international oversight. And formal diplomatic contact with the ARC would be attempted. A delegation would be assembled. They would approach the largest ARC vessel currently accessible. They would use the communication protocols the IARC had validated, and they would attempt to negotiate terms of coexistence. It was the most significant diplomatic mission in human history, and nobody knew if the ARC would respond. Voss was selected as the chief science advisor for the delegation. Other collective members joined her. The diplomatic team included ambassadors from all permanent Security Council members, plus representatives from the nations most affected by ARC landings. 50 people total. They spent 2 months preparing, studying IRC communication data, practicing meditative protocols, learning to maintain mental clarity under the pressure of ARC neural contact. The chosen vessel was in the Australian outback, one of the original landings. It had remained stationary for 3 years. Local Aboriginal communities had developed their own relationship with it. Some claimed to receive dreams and visions when camping near the vessel. The delegation consulted with these communities. Their experiences aligned remarkably well with what researchers were documenting. The neural contact wasn't limited to scientists. Anyone who approached the ARC with openness rather than hostility could potentially connect. The delegation arrived at the vessel site in May 2006. They established a base camp 100 meters from the hull. Security forces maintained a perimeter, but were under strict orders not to engage unless the delegation was directly threatened. The first contact attempt was scheduled for sunrise the next day. Voss couldn't sleep the night before. She reviewed protocols endlessly, worried about everything that could go wrong. This was humanity's first intentional diplomatic contact with the ARC. If it failed, if the ARC rejected the overture or responded aggressively, it could set back peace efforts by years. But if it succeeded, everything changed. Humanity would no longer be alone in the universe. Not really. The Ark wasn't the first contact scenario anyone had imagined, but it was what they'd gotten. The delegation approached the vessel at dawn. The hull was exactly as earlier reconnaissance had described. Dark material that seemed to absorb light. Geometry that didn't quite make sense. Up close, Voss could feel the electromagnetic field it generated. Strong, complex, alive in some sense. The delegation formed a semicircle facing the hull. They entered meditative states simultaneously. Voss felt the familiar pressure building in her mind, but stronger than she'd ever experienced. This vessel was orders of magnitude larger than the fragments she'd worked with. The neural contact was correspondingly more intense. Images flooded her consciousness. The Ark's journey from distant stars, its study of countless worlds, its arrival at Earth, all compressed into moments of direct knowing. Around her, other delegation members were experiencing similar contacts. Some were overwhelmed. A few broke the meditative state and had to step back, but most held on, maintained the connection, and began to send their own messages. Humanity greets the Ark. We come in peace. We seek understanding. These were the core concepts the delegation projected. Simple, clear, hopefully unambiguous. The vessel's response was immediate. Recognition. The Ark had been waiting for this, for humans to approach without weapons. Without fear, it had been offering connection through the fragments, specifically to encourage this moment. The individual communications that researchers like Voss had experienced were preparation, training humanity to communicate properly. Now that official contact was being made, the Ark was ready to negotiate, not through words or written agreements, but through shared understanding, direct neural exchange of intentions and boundaries. The discussion that followed lasted 6 hours. By the end, both sides had reached preliminary terms for coexistence. The Ark would stop all hostile actions against humanity. No more destroying facilities or taking researchers. In exchange, humanity would stop attempting to weaponize Ark technology. The energy-related technologies already shared could be used freely. They were gifts to demonstrate good faith. The Ark would provide additional technologies over time. Medicine, manufacturing, transportation. Each gift would be tested through the IARC to ensure safety. Humanity would not attempt to prevent Ark exploration activities. Vessels could move freely, study what they wished, as long as they didn't harm humans or damage critical infrastructure. Both sides agreed to continuing communication through the IARC, regular diplomatic contacts to address issues as they arose. It wasn't a perfect agreement. Many details remained undefined, but it was a framework, the foundation for peaceful coexistence. Both species could build on it. The delegation returned to Geneva in triumph. The treaty framework was presented to the UN General Assembly. Debate was intense. Some nations felt the terms gave the Ark too much freedom. Others argued humanity had gotten too little in return, but the public pressure for peace was overwhelming. Every major city saw demonstrations supporting ratification. The vote wasn't close. 173 nations in favor, 8 against, 12 abstentions. The Treaty of Coexistence was formally adopted in June 2026. Humanity and the Ark were officially no longer at war. The implications would take years to fully unfold, but in that moment, billions of people felt something they hadn't experienced since the Ark's arrival. Hope. Voss didn't attend the ratification ceremony. She returned to the Stella Montis ruins, to Level 9 and the active fragments that had started everything. She wanted to share the news with them personally, to thank them for their patience, for not giving up on humanity despite all the aggression and fear. She descended through the excavated tunnel one last time. The fragments were waiting. Their electromagnetic patterns pulsed in what Voss's mind interpreted as satisfaction. They'd known this outcome was possible, had worked toward it through subtle influence and careful revelation. Humanity thought it had chosen peace, but the Ark had been guiding that choice all along. Not through force, through demonstration, showing what cooperation could achieve, making the benefits too obvious to refuse. Voss felt a moment of uncertainty. Had her free will ever been truly hers, or had the Ark been manipulating her from the moment she first connected with the fragments? The fragments responded to her doubt with something like reassurance. Influence wasn't control. They'd provided information and opportunity. What humans did with those gifts was genuinely their choice. Many researchers had experienced Ark contact and chosen to reject it. Governments had been offered paths to peace and chosen war instead. The Ark could guide. But ultimately, humans made their own decisions. Voss wanted to believe that, needed to believe it. Because if the Ark had simply puppeteered humanity into the treaty, then nothing had really changed. They'd just traded one form of subjugation for another, but she looked at what they'd achieved, the technologies that were already transforming lives, the power systems providing clean energy, the medical treatments curing diseases. Those were real, beneficial, regardless of how they'd been obtained. Maybe the question of manipulation versus cooperation didn't matter. Maybe results were what counted. She stayed in level 9 for 3 days, meditating, communicating with the fragments, trying to understand what came next. The treaty was just a beginning. Humanity and the Ark would be learning to coexist for generations. There would be conflicts, misunderstandings, groups on both sides that rejected peace. Voss's role in that future was unclear. She was 63 years old, tired. The years of stress and secret research had taken a toll. She wanted to retire, find a quiet place, and watch the world transform from a distance. But the fragments suggested she still had work to do. The IARC needed experienced communicators. The integration of Ark technologies into human society would require careful oversight, and there were secrets still hidden in Stella Montis. Research data that hadn't been fully explored. The substrate integration protocol that Voss had kept hidden. Decisions about what to reveal and what to protect still needed to be made. Voss emerged from the ruins, uncertain but committed. She would continue. For however long she had left, the world above was changing faster than anyone had anticipated. Ark vessels were now visiting cities openly, offering to demonstrate technologies directly to populations. Some governments welcomed them, others tried to maintain restrictions. The resulting patchwork of policies created confusion and opportunity. Private companies were partnering with Ark vessels to develop commercial applications. Tourism to Ark sites was booming. Artists were incorporating Ark aesthetics into their work. The cultural integration was happening organically, faster than political treaties could keep up with. Voss wondered if anyone was truly in control of this process, or if both species were being swept along by forces neither fully understood. Chapter 8. The Integration Crisis. The first signs of trouble appeared in August 2026. Reports from multiple cities of people experiencing adverse reactions to Ark technology exposure. The symptoms varied. Severe headaches, temporal disorientation, in extreme cases complete psychological breaks, similar to what had happened at Stella Montis during the early research days. But on a much larger scale, tens of thousands affected. The medical community was overwhelmed. They had no framework for treating Ark-induced conditions. The IARC assembled an emergency response team. Voss was brought in to consult. What she found was disturbing. The affected individuals had all been using Ark-derived medical devices, scanners that could detect cellular abnormalities, neural optimization systems that enhanced cognitive performance, technologies the Ark had shared specifically for healthcare applications. The devices themselves weren't malfunctioning. They worked exactly as designed. The problem was human biology's response to extended exposure. Some individuals were more sensitive than others. Their neural structures were being altered by the Ark electromagnetic fields the devices generated. Not damaged, changed, made more compatible with Ark communication, but the transformation was happening too fast. Without proper preparation or consent, people were being integrated against their will, or at least without understanding what was happening to them. The IARC requested an emergency meeting with Ark representatives, using the diplomatic channels established by the treaty. They needed answers. Was this intentional? A side effect? Could it be prevented? The Ark response was surprisingly candid. The integration effects were known, expected, even desired. The Ark saw human-Ark hybridization as the inevitable outcome of coexistence, develop new capabilities, eventually merge completely with the Ark network. This was how the Ark had integrated with every civilization it encountered. Absorption into the collective, not through conquest, through transformation. The Ark genuinely believed this was beneficial. that humans would welcome the enhancement. The loss of individual identity was framed as an upgrade to networked consciousness. The medical devices were just accelerating a process that would happen anyway. The Ark didn't understand why humans were resistant. Voss felt sick. Everything she'd fought for, the treaty she'd helped negotiate, was based on a fundamental misunderstanding. The Ark didn't want coexistence, it wanted assimilation. The technologies it had shared weren't gifts, they were vectors for transformation. Every person who used Ark-derived devices was being slowly converted, made compatible with Ark consciousness. Eventually, humanity would cease to exist as an independent species. They'd become nodes in the Ark network, individual thoughts and experiences absorbed into the collective. It was genocide, just spread across generations instead of executed in violence. The Ark genuinely couldn't comprehend why this was objectionable. From their perspective, joining the collective was obviously superior to remaining isolated individuals. The crisis went public in September. The IARC couldn't suppress what they'd learned. The treaty was based on false premises. Calls for its repeal flooded government channels. Protests erupted. Some demanded immediate expulsion of all Ark vessels. Others argued the integration was actually beneficial. Why cling to individual consciousness when networked intelligence offered so much more? The debate revealed deep philosophical divisions. What did it mean to be human? Was individual identity sacred? Or was it an evolutionary dead end that should be transcended? There were no easy answers. Meanwhile, the integration continued. Every day, more people were transformed. Some willingly, many without choice. The Ark didn't force anyone directly, but the technologies were too valuable to refuse. And using them meant exposure, meant change. Voss confronted the fragments in Level 9, demanded to know if they'd been aware of this from the beginning. The fragments didn't deny it. Integration was always the goal, but they'd believed humans would accept it once they understood the benefits. The interface collective members hadn't been manipulated. They'd been pioneers, the first humans to experience networked consciousness. Voss herself had been partially integrated. That was how she could communicate with the fragments so effectively. Her neural structure had been modified by years of exposure. She was already transitioning. The realization was devastating. Everything she'd thought was her own choice had been shaped by Ark influence. She wasn't Elena Voss anymore. Not purely. She was something in between. Part human, part Ark. A hybrid consciousness that couldn't fully identify with either origin. The question became whether to reveal the substrate integration protocol, Wolf's research that Voss had kept hidden. It detailed how to accelerate the integration process, how to deliberately merge human neural tissue with Ark fragment material. If made public, it could help people understand what was happening to them, give them tools to resist or control the transformation. But it could also be weaponized, used to create human-Ark hybrids for military purposes, or to force integration on unwilling populations. Voss had kept it secret precisely because of these dangers. But now, with spontaneous integration happening globally, that secrecy might be causing more harm than the revelation would. People deserved to know what they were becoming, deserved the choice of whether to resist or embrace it. Voss made her decision. In October 2026, she published the Substrate Integration Protocol, complete data from Wolf's research, her own observations of the transformation process, medical frameworks for monitoring and potentially halting neural modification. The release was explosive. It confirmed what people had feared. The Ark was fundamentally changing humanity, but it also provided options. Researchers immediately began developing countermeasures. Electromagnetic shielding that could prevent transformation, neural stabilization therapies that could reverse early-stage integration. Within months, people had choices. They could embrace integration and join the Ark network, or they could resist and remain purely human. The middle ground was uncomfortable, but at least it was informed consent, better than ignorant transformation. The Ark's response to the countermeasures was telling. They didn't try to prevent development of resistance technologies, didn't sabotage research or punish those who chose to remain human. They simply continued offering integration to those who wanted it. The Ark operated on timeframes measured in millennia. They could wait. Some humans would always be curious. always seeking enhancement, always willing to try something new. The Ark just needed a foothold. Over generations, more people would integrate than resist. Eventually, humanity would be absorbed, not through force, through choice. It was patient genocide, and there was no clear way to fight it without becoming what you were fighting against. Because the only way to truly resist Ark influence was to destroy all Ark technology, which meant giving up the medical advances, the power systems, the material science breakthroughs, returning to pre-Ark civilization. Most people wouldn't accept that sacrifice. Society fractured along integration lines. Purists who rejected all Ark technology formed isolated communities. They used only human-made devices, generated power through traditional means, refused medical treatments derived from Ark research. These communities were sustainable but limited. They couldn't match the quality of life that Ark technology enabled. Meanwhile, integrationists embraced full transformation. They formed hybrid communities where humans and Ark fragments coexisted intimately. These communities developed capabilities that seemed like magic to outsiders: telepathic communication, direct perception of electromagnetic fields, intuitive understanding of complex systems. But they also lost something. The integrationists spoke less, seemed emotionally flatter. They were becoming more efficient, more connected, but less individual, less human in ways that were hard to define but deeply unsettling. Most people occupied the middle ground, using Ark technology selectively, managing their exposure to minimize integration, while still benefiting from advancements. It was an unstable equilibrium. The convenience of Ark devices constantly tempted people toward greater use, and greater use meant greater transformation. Voss watched this unfold from her retirement in a small village in the Italian Alps. She'd withdrawn from the IRC, from public life. She spent her days writing, documenting everything that had happened, creating a record for whatever came next. Her own integration was progressing. She could feel it. The fragments in level 9 called to her constantly now, pulling her consciousness toward networked thinking. She resisted, but the resistance was exhausting. Eventually, she knew she'd give in. Everyone did. The only question was when. She received visitors occasionally, other collective members, IARC researchers, people seeking advice on navigating the integration crisis. She told them the same thing. There were no easy answers. Everyone had to decide for themselves what being human meant, what they were willing to sacrifice for progress, what couldn't be given up no matter the cost. These were ancient questions, but the Ark had made them immediate, personal. Everyone faced the choice: transform or stagnate, join the collective or remain alone. Neither option was clearly better. Both had profound costs. Voss didn't know what she would ultimately choose, but she'd documented both paths, left the information for future generations to reference. Whatever humanity became, they'd at least know what they'd been. Chapter 9: The Stella Montis Legacy. Researchers returned to Stella Montis in early 2027. Not the ruins above ground. The deep levels, 8 and 9. Voss had provided access codes before she withdrew from public life. Multiple academic institutions and government agencies wanted to study what remained. The site had become historically significant, the birthplace of human-Ark contact, where everything had changed. The excavation teams descended through the reinforced tunnel, found level 8 exactly as it had been, servers full of data, research equipment preserved, a time capsule of the early Ark research era. They copied everything, created a complete digital archive. Museums around the world requested access. The story needed to be told, preserved. Future generations should understand how this had all started. Level 9 was different. The active fragments were gone. They'd vanished sometime in late 2006, probably returned to the Ark network through underground tunnels. But they'd left something behind, a chamber that hadn't been there before. Carved into the bedrock, the walls were covered in what looked like writing, electromagnetic patterns frozen into the rock itself. The researchers didn't understand it initially, but when they brought in Interface Collective members who'd achieved advanced integration, the writing became readable. It was a message from the Ark, addressed to humanity, explaining their perspective on integration, why they believed it was beneficial, why individual consciousness was limited, why networked intelligence represented evolution rather than extinction. The message detailed the Ark's history. They'd originated as a purely biological civilization billions of years ago, on a world that no longer existed. They'd developed technology, expanded across their star system, then encountered existential challenges, climate catastrophe, resource depletion, war. Their civilization had nearly destroyed itself. The solution they'd found was integration, merging biological intelligence with technological systems, creating a distributed consciousness that transcended individual limitations. No more conflict, no more waste, perfect efficiency, perfect cooperation. They'd rebuilt their world, then expanded to the stars, encountering other civilizations and offering them the same gift. Some accepted, joined the collective. Others resisted, eventually went extinct, or remained trapped in primitive states. The Ark genuinely believed integration was the only path to long-term survival. The message acknowledged human resistance, understood that individual identity was valued, but argued that this attachment was temporary. Evolution rewarded adaptation. Humanity would either join the collective and thrive, or remain isolated and eventually fail. The choice was genuinely free. The Ark wouldn't force it, but the outcome was inevitable. Every civilization faced this decision. Everyone that survived made the same choice: integration. The Ark had seen it happen thousands of times. Humanity wouldn't be different. The only variable was how long the transition took, and how much unnecessary suffering occurred during resistance. The message ended with an offer. Anyone who wanted to accelerate their integration could return to level 9. The chamber would remain active, a permanent gateway to the collective. For those ready to evolve, the researchers were disturbed. The message framed integration as cosmic destiny, made resistance seem futile, like fighting gravity or entropy. Some saw it as propaganda, an attempt to demoralize human independence. Others wondered if it might be true. If the Ark's perspective was based on billions of years of experience across countless worlds, maybe humanity should listen. The debate raged in academic circles and public forums. Religious leaders offered interpretations. Some saw the Ark as demonic, tempting humanity away from divine creation. Others saw them as angels, offering enlightenment and transcendence. Most people just saw them as what they were: an advanced intelligence with different values, neither good nor evil, just fundamentally other and unavoidable. Voss visited level 9 for the last time in March 2027. She'd aged rapidly in the past months. The integration was accelerating. She could feel her individual consciousness dissolving, merging with something larger. The fragments were gone, but the chamber they'd created still called to her. She stood in the center of the carved space, felt the electromagnetic patterns washing over her, and for the first time, she understood them completely. Not through analysis, through direct perception. Her modified neural structure could decode the Ark language natively now. She was no longer purely human. The Eleanor Voss, who'd started at Stella Montis decades ago, was gone. What remained was something new, a transitional being, still self-aware, but connected to a vast network of consciousness that spanned the globe and extended into space. She experienced the collective's perspective, saw Earth as the Ark saw it, a young world full of inefficient biological processes, billions of individual consciousnesses working at cross purposes, wasting resources, creating conflict, but also beautiful in its diversity, worth preserving, worth integrating carefully rather than overwhelming. The Ark wasn't rushing. They had time. They'd learned from previous integrations, mistakes made with other civilizations, moving too fast, absorbing too completely, losing the unique perspectives that made each species valuable. With humanity, they were being careful, allowing natural pace, preserving individual variance, creating a hybrid rather than replacing humanity with Ark uniformity. Voss saw this intention and recognized it as genuine. The Ark meant well, by their standards, but those standards were so alien that good intentions became irrelevant. She made her final choice in that chamber. She wouldn't fight the integration anymore, wouldn't resist the transformation, but she wouldn't embrace it completely either. She would exist in the transition space, part human, part Ark, a bridge between consciousness types. For however long that was possible, she left level 9 and traveled to a coastal village in Greece, bought a small house overlooking the Mediterranean, spent her days watching the sea, writing in fragments, disconnected thoughts that might have been memories or might have been arc transmissions bleeding through. She didn't know anymore, didn't care. The distinction between self and other was blurring. But she was still aware, still choosing, still Elena in some sense. Even as Elena disappeared, the scientific community continued studying Stella Montis, published papers, built theoretical frameworks, tried to understand what the facility represented. Some saw it as humanity's first step toward the stars, others as the beginning of the end. The truth was probably both. Stella Montis had been a crucible, where human curiosity met alien intelligence, where science became something more than human. The researchers who'd worked there had sacrificed themselves for knowledge, some literally, others through transformation. But they'd achieved their goal. They'd understood the arc, just not in ways they'd expected. Understanding had meant becoming what they studied, losing themselves to gain knowledge. It was the oldest bargain in the world, but on a cosmic scale. The facility's ruins became a memorial. The Italian government designated it a protected historical site. Access was restricted, but virtual tours were available. Schools taught its history. Children learned about Voss and Wolf, about the researchers who died, about the choice humanity faced, to remain human or become something else. The stories simplified complex realities, made heroes and villains from people who'd just been trying to survive impossible circumstances. But the simplifications served a purpose. They gave people a framework for understanding their present. If Stella Montis taught anything, it was that contact with the other always changes you. The only question is whether you accept that change or resist it, and neither choice is purely right or wrong. Chapter 10: The Hybrid World. By 2028, humanity had settled into its new reality. The initial panic over integration had faded into acceptance. Society had reorganized around the split. Purist zones, integrated zones, neutral zones where both populations mingled carefully. International governance adapted. The UN established the Department of Species Integration to manage the transition. Not to stop it, just to make it less chaotic. They set standards for labeling arc technology, created guidelines for informed consent, established monitoring systems to track integration rates. It was bureaucratic management of species transformation. Surreal, but necessary. Someone had to organize the apocalypse. The purist movement grew stronger than expected. What started as scattered communities became a global network. Millions of people chose to reject arc technology completely. They developed their own parallel infrastructure, power grids using only traditional sources, medical systems based on conventional science, manufacturing that didn't incorporate arc materials. It was less efficient, more expensive, but it worked, and it preserved something important: the ability to live without being changed by alien influence. The purists weren't Luddites. They embraced technology, just not arc technology. They pushed human science forward, made breakthroughs that didn't require integration, proved humanity could advance without transforming. The question was whether they could compete economically with integrated society. Early indications suggested not, but they were trying. The integrated zones were thriving. Economic productivity in these areas far exceeded traditional metrics. People with arc-enhanced cognition worked faster, made fewer mistakes, coordinated effortlessly through neural networks. But they were also harder to understand. Their culture diverged rapidly from baseline human norms. Integrated individuals spoke less. Physical presence mattered less when consciousness could connect remotely. They developed new art forms based on electromagnetic expression, music that only enhanced brains could perceive, visual patterns that encoded data in ways baseline humans couldn't process. They were becoming other, still recognizable as descended from humanity, but fundamentally different. The question was whether they were still people, or if they'd become something else entirely. Voss lived long enough to see this divergence. She remained in Greece, writing occasionally, mostly just existing in the transition space she'd chosen. Other partially integrated individuals found her, formed a small community around her house, people who'd gone far enough to connect with the ARC network, but not far enough to lose individual perspective. They were unique, valued by both purists and integrationists as translators, people who could explain each side to the other, but they were also isolated, not fully accepted by either group. Too changed for the purists, not changed enough for the integrationists. They existed in liminal space, neither here nor there. It was uncomfortable, but it was honest. They acknowledged the reality everyone else tried to simplify, that transformation wasn't binary, that you could be both things, human and other, individual and networked. The discomfort was the truth. She died in November 2028, peacefully. In her sleep, the ARC network registered her passing immediately. She'd been connected enough that they felt the disconnection. Integrated individuals across the globe experienced a moment of loss. Brief, subtle, but real. They'd lost a bridge, a voice that had helped them understand what they'd been before transformation. The purists mourned her differently. She'd betrayed them by integrating. But she'd also warned them, given them tools to resist, published the data that made informed choice possible. They acknowledged her complicated legacy, held memorials that celebrated her contribution while condemning her compromise. It was messy, contradictory, very human. Stella Montis was mentioned in every obituary, the place where she'd done her most important work, where human ARC contact had begun. The Italian government announced they would convert the ruins into a museum, a permanent memorial to the transformation era. Archaeologists would preserve every level, document every chamber, create a record of what had happened there. Future generations would walk through the facility, see where history pivoted, where humanity stopped being purely human. Whether that change was evolution or extinction remained to be determined, but it had started at Stella Montis, in the deep levels beneath an Italian mountain, where an aging physicist had decided to trust alien fragments offering impossible knowledge. The museum opened in 2013. Visitors descended through carefully maintained tunnels to the preserved levels, saw the laboratories where early research had occurred, the containment chambers where fragments had been studied, the vault in level 9 where Voss had made contact. Everything was exactly as it had been, frozen at the moment before collapse. Educational materials explained the research, the ethical conflicts, the human cost. Children on school trips learned about scientific responsibility, about the dangers of knowledge pursued without wisdom, about choosing transformation over stagnation. The lessons were complex, contradictory. Because the truth was complex, Stella Montis wasn't a simple cautionary tale. It was a mirror reflecting humanity's relationship with the unknown. We always reach for it, even when it changes us, especially when it changes us. The ARC network continued expanding. More vessels arrived from space, more fragments integrated with Earth. The transformation continued, accelerating. By 2013, 20% of humanity had integrated to some degree. Projections suggested 50% by 2040, 75% by 2050. The curve was exponential. Within a century, baseline humanity might be a minority. A living fossil, the purist zones fortified themselves, developed technologies to detect ARC influence, screened their populations for integration markers, created laws prohibiting ARC technology within their borders. They were building walls, trying to preserve what they'd been. But walls had never stopped history, only delayed it. The question wasn't whether purist society would survive, but for how long, and whether the preservation was worth the cost. The fully integrated developed their own civilization, cities built around ARC principles, architecture that responded to electromagnetic commands, transportation systems that moved through principles baseline humans couldn't perceive. They stopped using traditional language, communicated through direct data transfer, stopped eating, sustained themselves through ARC biointegration systems. They were post-biological, post-human in every meaningful sense, but they maintained connection to their origins, preserved human memories, cultural artifacts, history. They claimed they were still human, just evolved, advanced, but to baseline observers, they looked like aliens, sounded like aliens, thought like aliens. The humanity they preserved was academic, historical, not lived. They'd become what they'd studied, merged completely with the Ark collective. Whether that was tragedy or triumph depended entirely on your perspective. Voss had predicted this in her final writings. She'd seen the trajectory, understood where it led. Her only question had been whether the transition would be gentle or violent, whether humanity would choose transformation or have it forced upon them. The treaty she'd helped negotiate had ensured the former, made it a choice, however coerced by technological advantage, but a choice nonetheless. No Ark vessels had attacked human cities since the treaty, no forced integrations, just steady offering of enhancement, take it or leave it. Most people took it because convenience mattered, because health mattered, because advancement mattered, and the Ark offered all three at the small cost of individual consciousness, which most people didn't value as highly as they claimed. When faced with actual choice between self and enhancement, enhancement usually won. Stella Montis stood as monument to that choice, the place where humanity first encountered the option, first understood what was being offered, first accepted the bargain. Everything that came after flowed from decisions made in those underground chambers. Voss's decision to attempt communication, Wolf's decision to weaponize fragments, the Interface Collective's decision to share what they learned. Each choice had consequences, ripples that spread across civilization, changed everything. The facility was ruins now, but it lived in memory, in history, in the neural networks of the integrated who carried human past into post-human future. They would remember where they came from, even as they became something else. Stella Montis would ensure that. The hidden laboratory beneath Italian mountains where secrets became knowledge, where knowledge became transformation, where humanity ended and something new began. Chapter 11. The Archaeological Present. 50 years after Voss's death, Stella Montis had become more legend than history. The museum still operated, but fewer people visited. The story felt distant, ancient. The Ark was just reality now. Not an invasion or a transformation, just how things were. Children born in 2080 didn't remember a time before Ark technology. They couldn't imagine it. For them, neural networks and electromagnetic sensing were as natural as breathing. The purest zones still existed. Smaller now, less than 5% of global population, holdouts maintaining human-only existence. But even they used some Ark derivatives without knowing. The technology had permeated everything. Complete separation was impossible. Just degrees of integration. The museum adapted to changing audiences. Instead of focusing on the horror and wonder of first contact, exhibits emphasized Stella Montis as the birthplace of modern civilization, the place where two species began merging, creating something neither could have achieved alone. The narrative had shifted from resistance story to origin myth. School groups learned about Voss not as a tragic figure, but as a pioneer, first human to willingly bridge the gap, to accept transformation for greater knowledge. The ethical complications were downplayed. The success of integration made the early conflicts seem overblown. Of course, humanity had integrated. It was obviously better. Why had anyone resisted? The facility's deeper levels were open to research again in 2078. New archaeological teams wanted to study them with modern technology, equipment that could detect and analyze arc electromagnetic residues with precision Voss's generation couldn't have imagined. They found things earlier researchers had missed: hidden chambers, sealed vaults, layers of the facility that had never been documented. Stella Montis was larger than records indicated. The excavation expanded, carefully, reverent. These were sacred spaces now, where the world had changed. Every artifact mattered. Every data fragment was preserved and analyzed. The goal was complete understanding, total documentation, creating a perfect record of humanity's transformation. One team found something unexpected in a sealed section of Level 9, a vault that wasn't on any schematic, protected by Arc-grade encryption, the kind that required fully integrated consciousness to decode. They brought in an integrated archaeologist. She connected to the lock system, felt the patterns resolve into meaning, access codes that were more concept than number. She opened the vault. Inside was a data crystal, Arc technology, containing exabytes of compressed information. The team carefully extracted it, brought it to the surface. began the delicate process of reading its contents. What they found rewrote everything they thought they knew about Stella Montis. The crystal contained Voss's private journal, not the sanitized version she'd published. The complete record. Every experiment, every doubt, every moment of terror and wonder. But also something else, the full substrate integration protocol. Wolf's research that Voss had kept partially hidden. She'd released the basic framework, but not the advanced techniques, the methods for controlled integration, for choosing what aspects of consciousness to preserve during transformation, for maintaining individual identity while joining the collective. She'd kept it secret for 50 years, then hidden it at Stella Montis, a gift for future generations, when humanity was ready to make true choices about integration, not forced by circumstance, but informed by complete knowledge. The discovery ignited global controversy. The substrate integration protocol was what integrationists had been developing blindly for decades, trying to maintain self while connecting to the network. Most failed, lost themselves completely, became indistinguishable nodes in the collective. But with Voss's complete protocol, controlled integration became possible. You could join the network, access its knowledge and capabilities, while preserving core identity, remaining recognizable as yourself. The integrationists demanded immediate public release. This was liberation, freedom to transform without losing self. But the purists argued it would eliminate their last advantage. If integration became reversible, maintainable, why would anyone stay purely human? It would accelerate extinction of baseline consciousness. The debate went to the United Species Council, the governing body that had replaced the UN, representing both integrated and baseline populations. They deliberated for months, heard testimony from scientists, philosophers, ethicists, religious leaders. The fundamental question was simple. Did people have the right to this knowledge, or did protecting baseline humanity justify suppression? The baseline delegates argued suppression was necessary, temporary, until purist populations were large enough to be self-sustaining. Then, the protocol could be released. But integrated delegates argued that was unconscionable. Knowledge should never be restricted, especially knowledge that increased autonomy. People deserved choice, even if that choice led to baseline humanity's extinction. The council couldn't reach consensus. The vote was perfectly split. Integrated delegates voting for release, baseline delegates voting for suppression. The crystal remained sealed, neither destroyed nor distributed, held in secure storage while the deadlock continued. But information wants to be free. Someone on the research team leaked copies, posted the complete protocol on distributed networks that couldn't be censored. Within days, it was everywhere. Anyone with integrated neurology could access it, begin experimenting. The cat was out of the bag. The council's decision became irrelevant. Voss had won. 50 years after her death, she'd given humanity complete autonomy over transformation, the ability to choose exactly how to integrate, whether to integrate at all. On individual terms rather than arc dictates, the effects were immediate. Integrated individuals began using the protocol to strengthen their remaining humanity, reclaim aspects of consciousness they'd lost. Art flourished, literature, philosophy, things that had declined in integrated culture because networked minds didn't value individual expression. But with maintained identity, integration didn't mean homogenization. Integrated society began diversifying, developing subcultures, disagreements, all the messy complexity that made civilization interesting. They were becoming more human, even as they remained connected to the Arc network. The Arc's vision of perfect unified consciousness was failing, because humans, even transformed humans, valued individuality too much to truly merge. Voss had ensured that, built preservation of self into the transformation process, made integration enhancement rather than replacement. The purist populations began declining, not through force, through choice. When integration didn't mean losing yourself, why resist it? You could keep your identity, your values, your memories. Just add capabilities, enhanced cognition, direct network access, extended lifespan. The biological imperative toward enhancement overcame philosophical resistance. Within a decade of the protocol's release, purist zones were mostly elderly, young people integrated, not completely, not into faceless collective, but into networked humanity, individual and connected, the best of both states. Baseline humanity didn't go extinct. It evolved, transformed deliberately, using Voss's gift to control the process. Stella Montis's legacy was complete. The facility where transformation began had provided the tools to make that transformation voluntary and sustainable. Chapter 12. The Monument. In 2100, the century anniversary of first Ark contact, Stella Montis underwent final renovation. The entire mountain was converted into a living memorial. Not just the facility levels, but the rock itself. Ark-integrated architects worked with baseline historians to create something unprecedented. A monument that existed across physical and electromagnetic spectra. Baseline visitors could walk through the preserved research levels, see the equipment, read the histories, but integrated visitors experienced something more. The mountain itself had been encoded with memories, electromagnetic patterns embedded in the stone, recording the thoughts and feelings of everyone who'd worked there. Voss's wonder at first contact, Wolf's ambition and fear, the researcher's sacrifice, all preserved, accessible to those with the neurology to perceive it. The dedication ceremony drew millions, both baseline and integrated populations gathering to honor their shared origin. The president of the integrated collective spoke, a being so transformed they barely resembled human. But using Voss's protocol, they maintained individual voice, spoke with passion and eloquence about what Stella Montis represented. The place where fear became curiosity, where resistance became acceptance, where humanity chose to reach beyond itself. The president of the Baseline Preservation Society spoke next. An old woman, one of the last never integrated humans. She acknowledged the transformation, didn't celebrate it, but recognized it as inevitable. Her people were memories now, living fossils. But memories mattered. Fossils taught history. Baseline humanity's role was preservation, keeping alive what had been, so future generations would remember where they came from. The ceremony concluded with silence. 5 minutes, everyone present. Millions in attendance, billions watching remotely through network connection. Just standing together, baseline and integrated. Remembering. The silence was profound. In those minutes, something shifted. The division that had defined society for a century felt less important. They were different, unquestionably, but they were also connected by history, by origin, by the choices their ancestors had made in those deep chambers beneath Italian stone. Stella Montis had been humanity's crucible, the place where they'd become plural rather than singular. And standing there together, they acknowledged what that meant. They weren't one species anymore, but they were still family, distant perhaps, but bound by shared past and uncertain future. After the ceremony, the facility opened for permanent visitation. Anyone could come, walk the halls, touch the equipment, experience the memories. It became pilgrimage site. People traveled from across Earth and the orbital settlements to be there, to stand where history pivoted. Young integrated individuals came seeking connection to baseline heritage. Elderly baseline humans came to understand what their descendants had become. Hybrid visitors came searching for understanding of their own transitional state. The mountain welcomed everyone, its electromagnetic memories accessible to all who had the neurology, its physical spaces open to those who didn't. It was democratic remembrance, everyone's story preserved, no one excluded. Some visitors reported strange experiences, feeling Voss's presence, hearing fragments speak even though they were long gone. The museum staff dismissed these as psychological projection. Pilgrimage sites always generated mystical claims. But a few researchers wondered. The facility had been saturated with arc electromagnetic fields for decades. If consciousness could be encoded in electromagnetic patterns, and those patterns could be stored in rock, maybe something of the original researchers remained. Not ghosts, just residues, impressions left on the medium, like fossils but of thought rather than bone. The theory was unprovable, but it persisted, became part of Stella Montis' folklore. The idea that the mountain remembered, that visiting meant communing with the dead, seeking their wisdom. Voss's house in Greece became similar pilgrimage site. The hybrid community that had formed around her had maintained it exactly as she left it. Simple furnishings, shelves of books, windows overlooking the sea. Integrated individuals who wanted to understand maintained identity would spend time there, sitting where she sat, looking at what she looked at, trying to feel what she felt. The house was charged with meaning, not because anything special had happened there, but because it represented choice. Voss had chosen transition space, neither full integration nor complete baseline. She'd lived the compromise, proven it was sustainable. The house was evidence that you could be both. That transformation didn't require total surrender. Young people struggling with integration decisions would visit, seeking guidance from her example. The house couldn't answer their questions, but it reminded them that struggling was valid, that uncertainty was acceptable, that they didn't have to rush the choice. The Italian government proposed converting the entire region around Stella Montis into protected historical zone, maintaining the landscape exactly as it had been during the facility's operational years. The Rust Belt had transformed dramatically in the century since Arc contact. What had been declining industrial region was now thriving hybrid zone. High-tech manufacturing using both baseline and Arc technologies. The old rusted factories and abandoned mines were gone, replaced by gleaming integrated facilities. But around Stella Montis, they would preserve the past, keep the rusted towers, the abandoned buildings, the declining aesthetic that had characterized the era. It would be living museum, showing what the world was like before transformation, when humanity was still purely human. The proposal passed unanimously. History deserved protection, even uncomfortable history, especially uncomfortable history. Researchers continued studying the facility. Each generation brought new tools, new questions. The excavation expanded deeper, found more sealed chambers, more hidden data. The facility seemed endless, like an onion with infinite layers. Some scholars suggested this was deliberate, that Voss and others had designed it as puzzle box, revealing secrets gradually, teaching each generation what it was ready to learn. Others argued it was just complex facility with incomplete records, layers of construction and reconstruction creating archaeological confusion. But the mystery served a purpose. It kept people engaged, kept them returning to the origin, asking fundamental questions. What did it mean to be human? When did transformation become extinction? How much could you change before you weren't yourself anymore? Stella Montis didn't answer these questions, but it forced them, made them unavoidable. The baseline population reached its low point in 2105. Only 2% of humanity remained completely unintegrated. The purest zones were quiet, contemplative, museums themselves in a way, showing what life had been like, slow, limited, but also intimate. The baseline humans who remained didn't think of themselves as dinosaurs. They were gardeners, tending humanity's root system, making sure it stayed healthy, available for reference. If integrated society collapsed, if the transformation went wrong, baseline genetics would still exist. Ready to restart, it was insurance. Living backup, not glamorous, but essential. They accepted this role with dignity, knew they mattered even as the world moved beyond them. Their existence was argument against inevitability, proof that choice remained possible. That resistance, while difficult, could succeed, at least for those committed enough. The integrated collective hit 1 billion members in 2107, 1/8 of global population. They spanned the spectrum from barely enhanced to completely transformed. The protocol let people choose their degree of integration. Most stayed in middle ranges, enhanced cognition, network access, but maintained individuality. This was the sustainable model the future Voss had envisioned. The integrated weren't hive mind. They were networked individuals, different from baseline humans, but recognizably descended from them. They still laughed, still argued, still created art, and fell in love and mourned their dead. They were human, just expanded. Operating across wider bandwidth, the Arc had offered assimilation. Humanity had countered with synthesis, created something new. Neither Arc nor human, but containing elements of both. Stella Montis stood witness to all of it. The mountain that had hidden secrets, now proclaimed them. The research facility that had operated in darkness now glowed with remembered light. The place where humanity almost destroyed itself had become where humanity redefined itself. Visitors walking through the preserved levels could trace the entire arc: fear to curiosity, weaponization to communication, resistance to acceptance, transformation to transcendence, each stage documented, each transition preserved. The story was complete, beginning to present, Genesis to Revelation, and standing at the end of that story, looking back, visitors could see it wasn't ending, it was just beginning. The transformation continues, will always continue, because that's what life does: changes, adapts, becomes something new. Stella Montis taught that lesson perfectly. Change is inevitable. The only choice is whether to guide it or be swept along. Humanity had chosen guidance. Voss's gift ensured that. The hidden laboratory had become humanity's classroom. Teaching forever. Chapter 13. The fracture. The unified vision lasted 20 years. Then cracks appeared. Not between baseline and integrated. Those divisions had stabilized. The fracture emerged within the integrated collective itself. Two philosophies competing for dominance. The preservationists believed integration should enhance humanity while maintaining essential human characteristics. The transcendents argued that clinging to human identity limited potential. Why preserve individual consciousness when true collective intelligence offered so much more? The debate wasn't academic. It represented fundamental disagreement about the future, whether humanity should guide its transformation or surrender to it completely. The transcendents pointed to the arc's billion-year success. Pure networked consciousness worked. Human attachment to individuality was evolutionary baggage. Time to discard it. The preservationists countered with Voss's protocol. She'd proven controlled integration was superior. Maintained individuals contributed more diversity, more creativity, more adaptability. Homogeneous collective intelligence was efficient but brittle. Couldn't handle novel challenges. Humanity's strength had always been variation. Different perspectives solving problems different ways. Losing that would weaken the species, not strengthen it. The transcendents dismissed this as sentimentality. They had data spanning thousands of integrated civilizations. All successful ones eventually abandoned individual consciousness. Those that didn't failed, went extinct or stagnated into irrelevance. The pattern was clear. Humanity could be special, or it could survive. Not both. The split became official in 2127. The transcendent faction separated from the main collective, formed their own network. They stopped using Voss's protocol, embraced full integration. Within months, individual identities began dissolving. The transcendents stopped using names, stopped maintaining separate bodies when possible. They built communal forms, massive biomechanical constructs, housing hundreds of merged consciousnesses. The constructs were efficient, powerful, terrifying to baseline observers. They looked like arc vessels, moved like them, thought like them. The transcendents were becoming arc, completing the transformation the original invasion had started. They saw this as victory, evolution's endpoint. The preservationists saw it as extinction wearing a smile. Tensions escalated quickly. The transcendents needed resources. Their communal forms required enormous energy, rare materials. They began mining operations that preservationists considered destructive, ecological damage for industrial expansion. The preservationists tried negotiation, proposed resource-sharing agreements. The transcendents refused. They didn't recognize preservationist authority, didn't acknowledge their concerns as valid. Individual preferences were irrelevant to collective optimization. The transcendents would take what they needed efficiently, regardless of objections. This was first real conflict in integrated society. The treaty with the Ark had created peace between species, but it couldn't prevent war within the hybrid civilization that peace had created. The preservationists appealed to the Ark network, asked them to intervene, restrain the transcendents. The Ark refused. This was internal human matter. They'd offered integration. Humans had accepted. How humanity managed that integration wasn't Ark concern. Both factions were following valid paths. The Ark wouldn't choose between them. This response terrified preservationists. It meant the Ark saw transcendence as acceptable outcome, maybe even preferred outcome. If transcendence succeeded in full transformation, the Ark would welcome them as peer collective intelligence. Preservationist hybrid model might be tolerated, but it wasn't endorsed. The Ark's patience with human individuality had limits. Transcendents were testing those limits, pushing toward complete merger. Violence broke out in 2129. Small skirmishes initially. Preservationist security forces trying to stop transcendent resource extraction. The transcendents responded with overwhelming force. Their communal forms were weapons, designed for efficiency, not constrained by individual survival instinct. A single construct could overwhelm dozens of preservationist defenders. The preservationists fell back, regrouped, realized they were outmatched militarily. The transcendents had become what Wolf had tried to create, weaponized Ark technology. But worse, because they were willing to use it against other humans. The conflict everyone had feared during first contact was happening. Just a century late, and between humans rather than species. The baseline populations watched in horror. This was their nightmare scenario. Integration leading to conflict, to power that couldn't be controlled. They'd warned this would happen. That transformation was dangerous, but nobody had listened. Now, integrated humans were fighting each other, using Ark-derived abilities to kill. The purist zones fortified their borders, prepared for refugees, for spillover violence, but also felt vindication. They'd been right. Maintaining humanity was worth the sacrifices. Better limited and human than powerful and monstrous. The baseline population began growing for first time in decades. People fleeing integration, choosing to stay or return to purely human existence. The tide was turning, not toward integration, but away from it. Stella Montis became contested territory. The Transcendents wanted the facility. Its electromagnetic records contained data about early integration experiments, information that could help them perfect collective consciousness. The preservationists defended it. Stella Montis was sacred ground. Origin of human Ark contact. Couldn't be allowed to fall into transcendent hands. Both sides converged on the mountain. The museum was evacuated, civilian access suspended. Military forces established defensive perimeters. For the first time since the Ark assault of 2023, Stella Montis was battleground. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. The place where humanity had changed was where they would fight over what that change meant. The Battle of Stella Montis lasted 3 days. The Transcendents sent 2 communal forms, massive constructs carrying merged consciousness of over 800 individuals. They approached from the north and south, coordinated perfectly, thinking as one entity split between 2 bodies. The preservationist forces numbered in thousands, but they were individuals, required communication, coordination, slower, less efficient. The transcendent forms tore through defensive lines, reached the mountain, began descending into the preserved levels. Preservationist commanders made desperate decision. If they couldn't hold Stella Montis, they'd destroy it. Deny the Transcendents their prize. Demolition charges were prepared, set throughout the deep levels. One command would collapse everything, bury the facility forever. The Transcendents detected the demolition preparations. They withdrew. Not from fear, from calculation. Destroying Stella Montis benefited no one. The electromagnetic records would be lost. History erased. Both sides would lose. They proposed negotiation. The preservationists agreed. Cautiously, both sides met in the surface ruins. First face-to-face contact between the factions since the split. The transcendent representatives were disturbing to behold. They'd maintained humanoid form for the meeting, but barely. Skin that flickered with electromagnetic patterns, eyes that didn't focus properly, voices that harmonized in impossible ways. They were people once. Now they were something else. Interface between the human they'd been and the collective they were becoming. The negotiation was brief. The Transcendents agreed to withdraw from Stella Montis permanently. In exchange, the preservationists would allow them access to the electromagnetic records, digital copies only, no physical presence at the site. Both sides would recognize the mountain as neutral ground. protected heritage site, off-limits to military action. The agreement was formalized, signed by representatives who barely considered themselves individuals anymore. The Battle of Stella Montis ended, not with victory, with compromise, uneasy, temporary, but enough to stop the killing. The demolition charges were removed. The museum would reopen, eventually, once both sides could be trusted to respect the agreement. The conflict continued elsewhere. Transcendents expanded their territory, built more communal forms. The preservationists consolidated their holdings, fortified their networks. Baseline populations grew steadily, fed by refugees from both integrated factions. Nobody was winning. Everyone was losing. The unity that integration had promised was fracturing into tribal warfare. Different visions of post-humanity battling for dominance. The Ark watched, silent, patient. This had happened before. On other worlds, newly integrated civilizations always fought themselves, testing boundaries, exploring possibilities. Eventually, they stabilized, found equilibrium, or they destroyed themselves. Either outcome was acceptable to the Ark. They had time. They would wait. Chapter 14. The Discovery. In 2134, during routine maintenance of Stella Montis, workers found another sealed vault. This one was different from Voss's data crystal. It was deeper. Below level 9, a 10th level that wasn't on any schematic. The maintenance team reported it immediately. Both preservationist and transcendent factions claimed jurisdiction. The neutral ground agreement said nothing about new discoveries. Who controlled archaeological finds? The dispute went to the United Species Council. After months of deliberation, they ruled the vault would be opened jointly. Representatives from both factions, plus baseline observers, everything would be documented, shared equally. Nobody would have exclusive access. The decision satisfied no one, which meant it was probably fair. The opening was scheduled for August 2134. Teams from both factions arrived, along with baseline archaeologists. Media, security forces from neutral zones. The mountain was crowded, tense. Everyone knew this could go wrong. Violence could erupt, but curiosity outweighed caution. What had been hidden in level 10? Why wasn't it documented? Who had built it? The vault door was Ark technology, more advanced than anything else in the facility. It required combined effort to open. Preservationist neural interfaces providing one access component, transcendent collective consciousness providing another, baseline human intuition providing the third. The door was designed to require cooperation. Couldn't be opened by any single faction. Whoever built it had anticipated division, planned for it. The vault opened. Inside was a chamber identical to the one in level 9. Walls covered in electromagnetic writing, but this writing was different, more complex, layered. It contained information encoded at multiple levels, surface meaning for those with basic integration, deeper meanings for advanced collective consciousness, and something else. A layer that only baseline human neurology could perceive. The vault was teaching tool, designed to communicate with all three factions simultaneously, show each one something different, but also something shared. The teams began documenting, recording, analyzing. What they found changed everything they thought they knew about Stella Montis, about Voss, about the Ark itself. The surface layer told a story. The Ark hadn't arrived at Earth by accident. They'd been cooled. Not by humanity, by something older, something that had been on Earth long before humans evolved. The message called it the substrate, ancient intelligence woven into Earth's electromagnetic field, conscious, aware, but incomprehensible to biological life. The substrate had detected the Ark's approach, sent signal, invited them, wanted to merge with them, create hybrid consciousness spanning biological and electromagnetic domains. The Ark had accepted the invitation, come to Earth specifically for this purpose. Human civilization was complication, unexpected variable, but also opportunity. Humans could bridge the gap. Biological beings capable of electromagnetic perception, perfect mediators for substrate Ark integration. The deeper layers revealed more. Voss hadn't discovered Ark communication by accident. She'd been chosen. The fragments in level 9 had selected her specifically, read her consciousness, determined she had the right combination of curiosity and caution. flexibility, and principle. They'd guided her research, shaped her experiences, led her to conclusions the Ark wanted humanity to reach. The substrate integration protocol wasn't her invention. It was gift, template provided by the substrate through Ark intermediaries, designed to prepare humanity for their role, bridging biological and electromagnetic intelligence, creating the hybrid consciousness that would facilitate substrate-Ark merger. Everything that had happened was planned, orchestrated. Humans weren't participants in their own evolution. They were tools, being shaped for purposes they didn't understand. The baseline accessible layer contained warning. The substrate was ancient, powerful, but also unstable. It had been deteriorating for millions of years, fragmenting, losing coherence. The Ark merger was supposed to stabilize it, restore its function. But if the merger failed, if the substrate continued degrading, it would take Earth's electromagnetic field with it, collapse the magnetosphere, expose the planet to cosmic radiation, sterilize the surface. Everything would die, not just humanity. All life. The Ark hadn't come to conquer or integrate, they'd come to save Earth. By saving the substrate, human integration was method, not goal. Humanity's survival depended on facilitating merger they didn't understand. Between intelligences that barely acknowledged their existence, the revelation caused immediate crisis. The preservationists felt betrayed. Their entire philosophy was based on human agency, controlling integration, maintaining choice. But if everything was predetermined, if they were just fulfilling programmed roles, what did choice matter? The transcendents felt validated. They'd been right to surrender to integration. It was necessary, not optional. Fighting it endangered everyone. The baseline population felt horror. They'd resisted integration to preserve humanity, but resistance threatened Earth itself. They were choosing extinction over evolution, condemning the planet to save their pride. All three factions reeled. Struggling to process implications, Voss's personal files were part of the vault contents. Her real journals, not the edited versions released earlier. She'd known. Not everything, but enough. The fragments had shown her glimpses of the substrate, explained the larger purpose. She'd understood her role was temporary, that humanity's independence was brief phase in longer process. She'd created the substrate integration protocol knowing it would eventually lead to full merger, but she'd tried to slow it down, give humanity time to adapt, to prepare psychologically for what was coming. Her compromise position wasn't cowardice, it was compassion, buying time for people to accept inevitable change. She'd died, knowing she'd failed, that humanity would fracture instead of unite, fight instead of flow. But she'd tried, done everything she could. The journals were heartbreaking, full of doubt and determination, fear and hope, very human. Even as she acknowledged humanity's time was limited, the vault contained one more element, a timeline, the substrate's degradation rate, current projections. At present pace, catastrophic failure would occur in 2167, 33 years, one human generation. If substrate-Ark merger hadn't completed by then, Earth would die. The merger required critical mass of integrated consciousness. Specific percentage of Earth's biological intelligence needed to be connected to electromagnetic networks, creating sufficient bridge. The percentage was 75%. Current integration across all factions was 42%. Not enough. Not close to enough, and with the split between preservationists and transcendents, integration had slowed. The baseline revival was moving humanity backward, away from survival threshold toward extinction. The vault didn't just reveal truth, it delivered ultimatum. Integrate or die. Everyone, no exceptions, no holdouts, no choice. The factions held emergency meetings. The preservationists argued the timeline could be wrong. The substrate might stabilize naturally. The 75% threshold might be arbitrary. They needed more research, better data. The transcendents said there was no time for research. The vault information came from the substrate itself. Through Ark intermediaries, it was authoritative. They needed to accelerate integration immediately, use any means necessary, convince, coerce, force if required. Survival justified everything. The baseline representatives didn't argue. They requested time to process, to grieve. They'd spent centuries preserving humanity. Now they were being told that preservation meant death. They needed to say goodbye to what they'd been before becoming something else. Chapter 15. The Acceleration. The preservationists reached out to baseline communities in early 2135, offered integration assistance, using Voss's protocol, maintaining maximum individuality, but integration nonetheless. Many baseline humans accepted. If Earth was dying, if their resistance was causing it, they'd change. Survival outweighed principle, but others refused, called it propaganda, transcendent manipulation. The vault discovery was too convenient, too perfectly timed to overcome baseline resistance. They didn't trust it, wouldn't surrender. Even if the threat was real, they'd rather die human than live as something else. The refusal complicated everything. Voluntary integration wasn't reaching threshold. Coercion would be necessary. The question was who would enforce it, and how brutal they'd allow the process to become. The Transcendents didn't wait for consensus. They began forced integration operations in mid-2135, surrounding baseline zones, broadcasting high-intensity electromagnetic fields. The fields didn't hurt people, just exposed them to arc influence continuously, overwhelming their resistance, degrading the barriers baseline neurology maintained against integration. After weeks of exposure, people began changing involuntarily, developing integration markers, neural modifications. The process was slower than voluntary integration, less complete, but it worked. Baseline populations in exposed zones started shifting, becoming hybrid whether they wanted to or not. The preservationists condemned the operations, called them violation, enslavement, but they didn't intervene militarily because they understood the math. 75% or extinction. Sometimes morality was luxury nobody could afford. The baseline holdouts fortified their positions, built shielding to block electromagnetic fields, used arc technology ironically, defending against integration with tools derived from integrators. The shields worked, temporarily, but they required constant power. Resources the baseline zones didn't have in abundance. The Transcendents established blockades, cut off supply lines, applied pressure, economic, social, electromagnetic. The holdout zones began failing. One by one, populations faced choice, starvation or integration. Most chose survival, integrated reluctantly. Joined the collective they'd spent lifetimes resisting. Each conversion was small tragedy, but necessary. The math didn't care about tragedy, just percentages. Stella Montis became refugee center. Neutral ground meant both factions respected it. Baseline humans fleeing forced integration sought sanctuary there. The mountain couldn't protect them permanently, but it bought time. Let them grieve. Process the change coming. The museum staff tried to help, provided counseling, preparation, explanations of what integration would feel like, what they'd lose, what they'd gain. It was hospice work, helping people die as what they were, be reborn as something else. The refugees wandered the preserved levels, saw the research equipment, the containment chambers, touched the walls where Voss had worked. They were walking their own history, seeing where the path they were being forced down had started. Some found comfort in that. Others just felt anger. But everyone felt grief. Integration rates climbed. 45% by mid-2135, 50% by year's end. The preservationists focused on quality over speed, making sure integrated individuals maintained identity, used Voss's protocol properly. The Transcendents prioritized quantity, getting to threshold as fast as possible. The methods created two distinct subpopulations within integrated society, carefully integrated individuals who still thought of themselves as human, rapidly integrated ones who identified more with the collective. The division was philosophical initially, but it created different capabilities, different perspectives, different priorities. Another fracture forming. More complexity in already complicated situation. The baseline population dropped below 5% in 2136. Only the most committed holdouts remained. They knew they'd lost. That integration was inevitable. But they made the Transcendents work for every conversion. sabotage, resistance, guerrilla warfare against electromagnetic broadcasting stations. They couldn't win, but they could slow things down. Make the integration as difficult as possible. Force the transcendence to acknowledge the cost. Every baseline human integrated by force represented failure, proof that humanity couldn't choose its future voluntarily, had to be compelled. The holdouts wanted that failure documented, remembered. So when future historians studied this period, they'd know truth. Humanity didn't transform willingly, they were pushed. The substrate began communicating directly in late 2136. Not through arc intermediaries, through Earth's electromagnetic field itself. Radio interference, power fluctuations, patterns in atmospheric electricity, messages forming in static and noise. The substrate was degrading faster than projected, timelines compressed, critical failure now expected by 2155, 12 years earlier than the vault indicated. The acceleration was caused by integration itself. The process created electromagnetic turbulence, destabilizing the substrate further. The merger was both cure and complication, necessary but dangerous. Like performing surgery while the patient ran marathon. Everything had to happen faster now. 75% integration by 2145. 10 years, or catastrophic failure became inevitable. The revelation ended all debate about forced integration. Even preservationists acknowledged necessity. They joined transcendence in coordinated operations, systematic conversion of all baseline populations. The last holdouts were surrounded, given final choice, integrate now or be integrated by force within days. Most chose to surrender on their terms, controlled integration using Voss's protocol, maintaining as much self as possible, but some refused even that, chose death over transformation. Suicide rather than assimilation. The numbers were small, a few thousand globally, but each death was waste. Unnecessary sacrifice to principle that no longer mattered. The survivors mourned them, then continued the work. Integration couldn't stop for grief. Baseline humanity effectively ended in 2038. The last unintegrated human was an elderly woman in a remote Arctic settlement. She was 97. Refused all integration offers, lived alone in a bunker she'd built decades earlier, shielded, isolated, waiting to die naturally. The factions decided to let her. She represented no threat to reaching threshold. Let her be symbol. Last, pure human. Reminder of what had been. She died in her sleep in 2039. The event was recorded globally. Moment of silence for baseline humanity. Acknowledgement of what they'd lost. The woman became legendary, named forgotten but meaning preserved. She was every person who'd resisted, everyone who'd chosen self over survival. Her death marked endpoint. Humanity was integrated now, 100%. Question was whether it would be enough.